Before this hearing begins, I'd like to pass along some notes. About the system we're going to use. This hearing will be broadcast live.
Five, four, three, two, one. The hearing will come to order. Good morning and welcome to the Budget Committee's hearing on the Department of Defense's fiscal year 2022 budget. At the outset, I ask unanimous consent that the chair be authorized to declare a recess at any time. Without objection, so ordered. We're holding this hybrid hearing in compliance with the regulations for committee proceedings pursuant to House Resolution 965, carried over to the 117th Congress via House Resolution 8. Members and witnesses may participate remotely or in person. I would like to remind members that we have established an email inbox for submitting documents before and during committee proceedings, and we have distributed that email address to your staff. For individuals who are participating remotely, consistent with regulations, the chair or staff designated by the chair may mute a participant's microphone when the participant is not under recognition for the purpose of eliminating inadvertent background noise. Members participating remotely are responsible for unmuting themselves when they seek recognition. We are not permitted to unmute members unless they explicitly request assistance. If I notice that you have not unmuted yourself, I will ask you if you would like to have staff unmute you. If you indicate approval by nodding, staff will unmute your microphone. They will not unmute your microphone under any other conditions. Members participating remotely must have their cameras on and be visible on screen in order to be recognized. Members may not participate in more than one committee proceeding simultaneously. Finally, in light of the attending physician's new guidance, individuals physically present in the hearing room who are fully vaccinated do not need to wear a mask or socially distance, though they may choose to do so. Individuals who are not fully vaccinated must continue to wear a mask unless they are speaking under recognition and must continue to socially distance. Now, I will introduce our witnesses. This morning, we will be hearing from the Honorable Michael J Mccord, Undersecretary of Defense, Comptroller, and Chief Financial Officer of the U.S. Department of Defense, and Vice Admiral Ronald A. Boxall, Director of Force Structure, Resources, and Assessment, the Joint Staff, U.S. Department of Defense. We welcome both of you. I now yield myself 5 minutes for an opening statement. I'd like to welcome Vice Admiral Ronald A. Boxall. Thank you for your service and for joining us today to testify on the Department of Defense's fiscal year 2022 budget. Your expertise and insights will be enormously valuable to our hearing today. And I would like to congratulate the Honorable Michael J Mccord on his recent confirmation on being the first person to hold the comptroller position at DOD a second time. I'd also like to welcome you back to the Hill, specifically to the Budget Committee. In addition to being a longtime professional staff member of Senate Armed Services Committee, Undersecretary Mccord also served on the staff of the House Budget Committee, and I also want to thank you for your service. As we begin this hearing, I believe you both would agree that we all share a responsibility to provide the necessary resources to defend our country, and that includes maintaining a military that is second to none. I also believe you would agree our national security depends on more than just military might. It requires a whole-of-government approach, strong diplomacy, effective homeland security activities, aggressive mitigation of the destabilizing effects of climate change, readied pandemic defenses, robust veterans programs, and an economy poised to compete and win, which underpins our national strength. The President's budget recognizes the undeniable connection between these goals and invests in a comprehensive plan for our national security. This commitment starts with our service members who step up and put their lives on the line. As a nation, we should do everything we can to avoid conflict and call on them only when absolutely necessary. But we should also take care of them every step of the way. That's why the President's budget proposes a 2.7% pay raise for service members, as well as $113.1 billion in funding for the Department of Veterans Affairs, which includes $97.5 billion for healthcare programs. On top of that, the budget proposes the largest increase in recent history to advance the VA's understanding of traumatic brain injuries, the effects of toxic exposure on long-term health outcomes, and the needs of disabled veterans. It is a budget that truly recognizes the invaluable service and the extraordinary sacrifices of our men and women in uniform. But the best way we can protect members of our armed forces is to keep them out of harm's way, to resolve conflicts through diplomacy and only turn to military action when there is no other option. As former Secretary of Defense Jim Mattis famously said, if you don't fully fund the State Department, then I need to buy more ammunition. That is why it is so important that President Biden's budget for 2022 fully funds diplomatic and foreign assistance operations by providing an 11% increase above the 2021 enacted level. The President's budget includes other strategic investments that will broadly strengthen our national security, increase our readiness, and ensure the United States remains a global leader. This includes the largest research and development investment ever requested, with investments in hypersonics, artificial intelligence, microelectronics, 5G technology, and cyber capabilities. The reality is that our competitors and adversaries, including China, are already investing heavily in state-of-the-art defense technologies, and we cannot risk falling behind. We also cannot ignore the risk that climate change poses to our military bases and mission readiness. Already declared a national security threat, impacts of the climate crisis are directly threatening roughly 2/3 of the 79 mission assurance priority installations operated by DoD. That's 2 out of 3 of some of our military's most important bases and facilities. The President's budget addresses this threat head-on, making critical investments to enhance resilience and readiness while reducing the Department of Defense's climate impact. And finally, the President's plan restores accountability to the Department of Defense budget. The American people deserve to know how their tax dollars are spent, but for too long, the Overseas Contingency Operations, also known as OCO, designation has been exploited to skirt budget caps. The President's budget restores accountability by eliminating this loophole and funding all operations from within the base budget. This will provide more predictable funding streams, increased transparency, and better management of resources. Above all, it makes the budget more honest. Once again, I appreciate both of you coming today, and I look forward to your testimony. With that, I'd like to yield 5 minutes to the ranking member, Mr. Smith, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Welcome, Undersecretary McCord and Vice Admiral Boxall. Thank you for being here. President Biden and Washington Democrats are leading the effort in this budget to defund our men and women in uniform. But that's just part of a larger effort to defund the safety and security of the American people, whether it's at our border or in our local communities. And it layers billions in funding to satisfy the priorities of their wealthy friends, supporters, and political cronies. This is nonsense, or what we in Missouri call hogwash. This budget shows me there's very little concern for the safety and security of our troops and the American people. They serve bravely to protect. It shows an unwillingness to stand strong with our allies and will embolden our enemies. I have to say, I don't envy the position you're in right now. While President Biden is proposing to effectively flatline your budget, some of my colleagues on the other side and in this chamber are actually fighting about whether that is still too generous. If you'll recall, just last year, Senator Sanders and his progressive friends voted to slash your budget by 10%. And even some in this chamber are calling to cut more than 50% from your budget. $350 billion. Many of us are all deeply concerned about the effects on our military if they get their way. Our number one job is to keep Americans and their families safe at home. Blind cuts to America's military would be a disaster and take away important resources from our men and women in uniform, resources they need to stay safe and meet the challenges facing our nation, including the rise of China. Unfortunately, this budget falls short. The president is pushing a massive spending and tax plan, $17 trillion to our debt, increases taxes up to $55 trillion. In fact, the president breaks his promise not to raise taxes on low income and the working class, and he does it in this budget. The administration wants to give non-defense agencies 16% raise on average, on top of the billions Congress has already provided in response to the pandemic. But for your department, it would reduce spending to the lowest level in over 80 years. The lowest level in over 80 years. By that time, under this budget, Americans will pay more to settle the interest on our national debt that President Biden has run up than we will spend on our entire national defense budget. On top of that, this budget request fails to keep up with inflation. The rising prices Americans are already seeing at the pump and in the checkout line are a direct result of this administration's reckless spending. Continuing these policies will only make it worse and drive up procurement costs, the cost of the very equipment and tools our military members need to do their jobs safely. Many of my colleagues, myself included, are deeply concerned about the cuts inflation would force you to make because of this radical budget and the strategic advantage it will give America's enemies. But even the meager amount of funding this budget offers your department, it fails to fully prioritize America's military defense. In fact, when I read this budget, I notice significant cuts to critical programs, and a lot of that money will instead be used to impose Green New Deal policies on our military. President Biden's budget would repurpose $617 million in funding towards climate resilience and energy efficiencies. These changes will undoubtedly require cuts in other areas like equipment for our military men and women, Navy warships, Air Force fighter craft, and reduce overall military procurement and resources for our troops. To put it simply, this budget cuts America's defense and gives massive raises to Washington bureaucrats by overspending and taxing the American people. It is clear President Biden and his administration are out of touch with the working class. Last month at the Naval Academy, Vice President Harris joked that service members would prefer to carry solar panels than batteries, even though solar panels also require batteries to store energy. This budget for our military is a solution in search of a problem. There will always be areas in need of improvement in our federal agencies, but blindly cutting military spending is not the way to do it. And just like the Vice President's joke, this budget does not land well with the American people. Yield back.
Thank the ranking member. In the interest of time, I ask that any other members who wish to make a statement submit their written statements for the record to the email inbox we established for receiving documents before and during committee proceedings. We have distributed that email address to your staff. I will hold the record open until the end of the day to accommodate those members who may not yet have prepared written statements. Once again, I would like to thank our witnesses for being here this morning. The committee has received your written statements, and they will be made part of the formal hearing record. You will each have 5 minutes to give your oral remarks. Undersecretary Mccord, you may begin when you are ready.
Thank you, Chairman. Chairman Yarmouth and Ranking Member Smith, distinguished members of the committee, thank you for this opportunity to testify on the President's FY22 budget request for the Department of Defense. It's a pleasure to appear today along with Admiral Ron Boxall, who is the Senior Advisor to the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs on all military resourcing issues and played a key role in developing the budget. As the Chairman noted, nearly 20 years ago, I served on the staff of this committee, and I appreciate the role you play in the difficult task of setting priorities as Congress exercises its power of the purse to address our nation's needs. Last month, as you know, President Biden released his FY22 budget request, which includes $753 billion in discretionary spending for national defense, of which there is $715 billion for the Department of Defense that we're here to discuss today. This represents a 1.6% increase and is focused on meeting the national security challenges of both today and tomorrow. The request makes smart and disciplined investments in national defense. It is guided by the President's interim national security strategic guidance, which came out in March, which aligns national security, economic, and domestic policies and outlines a balanced approach among our diplomatic, military, and other tools. The budget helps us maintain the capability and global posture we need to back up the hard work of our diplomats and our allies and partners. This budget supports the President's priorities from fighting COVID-19 pandemic, which is so important to getting the economy back on track, to preparing us to better address the effects of climate change. For DoD, this includes investments in energy-saving platforms, resilient installations, and more efficient and diverse power sources. This budget is also guided by Secretary Austin's message to the force, which lays out his 3 priorities for the department, which are defend the nation first, take care of our people, and succeed through teamwork. So this request fulfills Secretary Austin's direction to match our resources to our strategy and our strategy to our policy. The department's request funds the mix of capabilities that are needed to most defend the nation. Our detailed budget materials have been provided to the Congress, so I'm not going to read you a long list of what's in the budget, but I'll just focus on a few main points if I could. With China identified as the pacing challenge for us, you'll see $5 billion for the Pacific Deterrence Initiative that Congress created last year, and broader investments to bolster deterrence and maintain our competitive advantage in the Indo-Pacific region. The budget also addresses persistent threats from Russia, Iran, North Korea, and other transnational and non-state actors. Our drawdown of military forces from Afghanistan remains on pace, and the FY22 budget shows the department is engaged in a deliberate and orderly drawdown from Afghanistan. In conjunction with the end of that military mission in Afghanistan, the President's budget terminates the Overseas Contingency Operations funding category, as the Chairman noted. To give us the trade space to focus on the future, the FY22 budget proposes some tough choices to divest about $2.8 billion of older and less capable platforms that we do not believe are suited to help us fight and win in the future. As Secretary Austin has testified, we need to fight and win the next war and not the last one. To that end, the President's budget request for research and development funding is the largest ever at $112 billion. This includes investments in both the key enabling technologies that are crucial to the global competition that is already underway, such as artificial intelligence, microelectronics, and 5G technology, as well as investments in the key military-specific technologies and capabilities, such as hypersonics, long-range fires, space-based systems, shipbuilding, and nuclear modernization. Of course, the President's budget also invests in our troops and their families. As Secretary Austin noted in his message to the force, taking care of our people is one of his top priorities. The budget request includes a 2.7% pay raise for both military and civilian personnel and funds our health care, child care, and other programs for our people. Finally, I just close with a couple of comments related to the financial management of the department, which is the other half of my responsibilities. The department's leaders take very seriously the importance of being good stewards of taxpayer dollars and ensuring the transparency for the money that Congress provides us. On that front, while our journey to the path down to a clean audit for the entire department is going to take longer than we would like, the department is working hard to address our audit findings, and I'm encouraged by the progress that's been made in recent years. I want to assure you this progress will continue. With that, thank you for the opportunity to speak with you today. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. McCord. I now yield 5 minutes to Vice Admiral Boxall.
Thank you, Chairman. Chairman Yarmouth, Ranking Member Smith, and distinguished members of the committee. I appreciate the opportunity to testify to you today, and I'm honored to represent the soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines, and Guardians of the United States Joint Force, the most capable in the world. We are in an era of increased strategic competition. The strategic landscape is rapidly changing, and we're witnessing a fundamental shift in the character of war. In particular, China is increasing its military capability at an aggressive rate. We must ensure that we retain our competitive and technological edge against this pacing threat. The 22 budget develops, procures, and modernizes space, cyber, air, naval, and ground forces that will project greater power at longer ranges and with higher speeds than ever before. Further, it enhances our nuclear triad, missile defense, and long-range fire systems, laying the foundation for a joint force capable of dominating in a future multi-domain conflict. The FY22 budget prioritizes nuclear modernization that will ensure a safe, secure, and effective future nuclear deterrent. Strategic deterrence is foundational to every mission the United States and our allies and partners execute. A strong nuclear deterrent enables U.S. diplomacy, reassures allies, deters adversaries, and leads to peaceful resolution of international disputes. However, key systems within the U.S. nuclear triad are beyond their original design lives. The FY22 budget invests over $27 billion to recapitalize Cold War-era strategic deterrent systems. Adversary investment in ballistic, cruise, and hypersonic missile technologies elevate the threat of strategic attack on the U.S. homeland. This budget invests over $20 billion to enhance our missile defeat and defense capabilities. It also continues development of a next-generation interceptor to defend the nation from missile attack. Additionally, this budget strengthens regional missile defense by fielding improved Patriot missiles, developing a new theater high-altitude area defense interceptor, and deploying 4 U.S. Army SHORAD short-range air defense battalions. As China and Russia are fielding long-range and hypersonic weapons with the capability to threaten our allies, partners, and U.S. forces, the budget equips the joint force to counter these threats with $6.6 billion investment that transforms our multi-domain long-range fires capability. We will field new hypersonic weapons on air, land, and sea platforms, and also procure and modernize subsonic offensive missiles. Our investments in new and modernized long-range fires will deliver a diverse portfolio of capable of holding adversaries at risk in operationally relevant ranges at speed. China and Russia are also challenging U.S. advantage in space by fielding weapons to deny or destroy our space capabilities. Lasers, electronic warfare, grappling systems, and direct action projectiles are a few technologies our adversaries have fielded or are developing to blind, jam, or destroy U.S. space systems. The FY22 budget invests $20.6 billion to modernize U.S. space capabilities that will enhance joint warfighting operations while improving the resilience of these systems. As in space, U.S. prosperity and military success depend on defending our cyber networks while deterring our adversaries and non-state actors with offensive cyber capability. The recent wave of ransomware events involving critical American infrastructure demonstrate the need for a robust, modern, and ready cyber force. The FY22 budget invests over $10 billion in programs designed to defend the homeland, compete with adversaries, and prepare for a future conflict through improved offensive and defensive cyber. In the air domain, we're investing $52 billion to modernize and build capacity in 4th and 5th generation aircraft, while devoting $1.5 billion to develop next-generation air dominance systems. It also recapitalizes the aging air mobility fleet. In the maritime domain, FY22 budget invests $34.6 billion to research, develop, and procure warships and submarines with credible combat power to China. It also ensures on-time delivery of the Columbia-class nuclear ballistic missile submarine. In the land domain, the budget invests over $12 billion in next-generation combat vehicles to increase joint force speed, firepower, and survivability while enhancing soldier lethality with improved squad weapons. In addition to modernization, the budget will enhance readiness to ensure our servicemen and women remain the best trained and best equipped in the world. The FY22 budget requests $122 billion for military readiness. From ranges to flying hours, we're looking at addressing readiness differently than in past years by improving maintenance data analytics and parts availability, which will enable maintainers to repair ships, aircraft, and brigades in shipyards, hangars, and depots with greater agility. We'll also work with Congress to divest legacy platforms that overburden military readiness accounts. Without those divestments, we cannot afford to modernize and meet the rapidly changing environment. Finally, our budget request reflects the President's decision to withdraw from Afghanistan, and as the joint force conducts a safe, responsible, and deliberate strategic retrograde from Afghanistan, this reposturing will enable fiscal savings that will be realized toward our modernization efforts outlined above. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Vice Admiral. We'll now begin our question and answer session. As a reminder, members may submit written questions to be answered later in writing. Those questions and responses will be made part of the formal hearing record. Any members who wish to submit questions for the record may do so by sending them electronically to the email inbox we have established within 7 days of the hearing. I now recognize the gentleman from New York, Mr. Higgins, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Undersecretary McCord, under this budget, it says that there's a request to eliminate the Overseas Contingency Operations Fund. Can you explain what that is?
Yes, Congressman, thank you. The Overseas Contingency Operations Account was created about 10 or 12 years ago as an alternative to the practice that had preceded it for expenses in Iraq and Afghanistan of using supplementals only that came in partway through the year, were not included in the president's budget. It was intended as an improvement to increase, at the time, transparency by putting those costs in the budget and giving more oversight to the Armed Services Committee. In time, it got to be, I would say, outlived its usefulness. So that account, which in recent years has primarily been related to expenses in Afghanistan, now that the president is withdrawing forces from Afghanistan, it seems timely to us to terminate that account, and any remaining expenses that go to the larger overhead costs, if you will, of operating in the Central Command region are now going to be folded into the regular budget as they are with other combatant commands around the world.
So the overseas contingency account was deficit financed?
It was, in terms of the deficit, it was no different than any other spending. Yes, because we ran deficits, you could argue that it was part of that. It certainly contributed to the deficits. And it was outside the Budget Control Act caps. It was a conscious decision of those that wrote the Budget Control Act, I would say. The OCO spending, as it was called, existed at the time the Budget Control Act was created, and it existed every time the Budget Control Act was amended. The system was left in place where that spending was over and above the base budget for defense, which I think got to be an issue and got to be a problem that was subject to abuse in some cases. And so that's part of the reasoning for the termination of it is no Budget Control Act and the mission in Afghanistan winding down. There are, I think, two reasons that both, either one separately and certainly both combined, argue that this is the right time to move away from that construct.
Is the Taliban stronger in Afghanistan today than it was 20 years ago?
Congressman, I'm not in a position to assess that personally, but the Taliban, is endemic to Afghanistan, and certainly I think nobody is surprised that they remain a player both politically and in terms of the security situation there.
So after 9/11, we took out the Taliban, and now we're negotiating for peace with the Taliban.
Congressman, I would say that the goal after 9/11 was to deal with al-Qaeda and threats to the United States. I don't know that we ever had the goal of removing the Taliban as an influence in the country of Afghanistan. I think that would be an
Well, who did we
task.
take out in 2001 in Afghanistan? The Taliban government that was in control, correct?
In terms of governing the country, yes, but removing them from the country, which I thought was your question, the answer would be no.
But they were in control, and they seem to be, on the ascent today relative to controlling the country post American withdrawal.
I would, again, as the CFO, that's a little bit outside my area, but I would say it's too soon to make that judgment. They have influence in some provinces, not in others. I couldn't assess whether they are in any, what is the likelihood that at some point they might regain political control writ large of the country. That's not where they are today.
What would you estimate the total American costs in actually 3 wars in the Middle East over the past 20 years? I
would say of the last 2 over the last 20 years, about 1.7 trillion, I believe, roughly equals Iraq and Afghanistan and related Syria. Going back 30 years to Desert Storm, if we're including that too, that was under $100 billion, so it would still be in the neighborhood of about 1.7, I think, 1.75 trillion.
And where does that estimate come from?
Those would be the obligations that we track separately as the cost of those wars. That's something that Congress has asked us to do, and we have done, the department has done since Desert Storm, is keeping track of the incremental costs of those operations and reporting them on a quarterly basis.
Are you aware of studies that cite that the number is much higher, like between $4 and $6.5 trillion?
I am. I'm aware of those studies that project future healthcare costs and things of that nature, yes.
I see. What about Iraq? We have a situation where we went in there and took out, a bad Sunni by the name of Saddam Hussein, put in a bad Shia by the name of Nouri al-Maliki, and it seems as though the Iran and the Shia militias are controlling Iraq today. Is that an accurate characterization?
Again, Congressman, I'm not in a position to assess the politics of other nations, but I would just say that given the large Shia population in both countries, I mean, the idea that there will be no Iranian influence in Iraq is probably not realistic. I wouldn't assess them as controlling the country.
Gentleman's time has expired. I now yield 10 minutes to the ranking member.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Undersecretary McCord, thank you for appearing before our committee today. As you know, this request will provide $753 billion for the total national defense budget, a 1.6% increase. That does not even keep up with inflation. In the final 5 years of the budget, defense spending increases by a measly 1% a year. This budget would harm the military's ability to carry out its job effectively, keep our men and women in uniform safe, and defend and protect American families. The 2018 Bipartisan National Defense Strategy Commission made it very clear that the DoD budget requires 3 to 5% growth above inflation. However, when asked if this budget helps build a larger and more capable fleet during a House Armed Services Committee hearing, Admiral Michael Gilday said, "No, sir, it does not." Mr. McCord, how does a budget that proposes to reduce defense spending as a percentage of the economy to the lowest level in 80 years give us the ability to protect our men and women serving our country while also maintaining our primary mission of keeping America safe?
Thank you, Congressman. I would say that the chairman and the secretary have testified before all 4 oversight committees in the last week or two. They have said at every committee, which I would agree with, that this budget gives us the resources we need to do the job. The percentage increase from last year, I know, is one valid yardstick. There are certainly others. The defense budget has grown about 20% in real terms. The base budget has over the last 4 or 5 years. So looking over a longer time period, this budget has had a pretty healthy increase. Certainly from when I last held this position, it is significantly larger. So
would you commit that that today that the DoD will not cut or reduce spending on programs designed to protect, defend, and secure our country and the American people?
Well, I would say this budget funds what we need to do the job, and I think that's the.
So there's no chance that you're going to cut programs that would fall into that?
I'm not sure if I understand your question.
I just want to make sure that you won't be reducing spending on programs designed to protect, defend, and secure our country and the American people.
No,
if you can just say, yes, we won't, that's what I want to hear.
The budget adequately funds those programs.
Okay. Next, I want to ask about recent efforts from some of my colleagues, actually in this committee, to cut the defense budget by $350 billion per year. This means that the president's current budget, which flatlines military spending, would be cut further by 54%. I have right here a plan by Democrats that plan it will use funds cut to keep our nation and our people safer. Under Secretary McCord, would a $350 billion cut to defense, quote, keep our nation and our people safer?
No, Congressman, that would be an extremely chaotic and disruptive cut to our budget.
How would you prioritize those cuts if you were forced by Congress to cut $350 billion?
We would always want to try and take care of our people first, and not force people out into the economy with no notice. So if we were trying to protect our people, it would have to be a massive disruption to our acquisition
It'd be a huge
program.
disruption. So to date, how much money has DoD spent litigating and settling border wall contract disputes, and how many contracts has DoD canceled since Biden became president?
I would have to get that for the record for you. I'm not sure that any litigation that we're involved in has gotten to the point of settling and incurring legal expenses. But I anticipate that there will be litigation with both private landowners and others pursuant to these changes in policies.
Do you know how many contracts has been canceled?
I don't know the number, but we can certainly get that for you.
I would definitely like that. I appreciate that. Do you, every member on this dais has had to assist members of our military or veterans get access to care for illnesses or injuries sustained in service. A good example is Agent Orange, where DOD and VA denied a link between the use of Agent Orange and serious illnesses like cancer. Veterans had to fight hard to get treatment for that cancer and compensation for their families. I voted just last Congress for the Blue Water Vietnam
Okay, well, apparently we're back up and running.
Give her a few minutes to get back to,
Yeah.
to her desk. This place. All right, we'll wait for
So
Sam.
apparently a contractor working in the building destroyed some equipment, and that shut everybody down, but it's been corrected, so we'll be back up in a couple minutes.
So just to confirm for members joining virtually, the issue has been resolved and we will resume momentarily.
All right, everyone, the sound on the live stream is back up. We will continue where we left off. The ranking member will have 7 minutes for questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As you could imagine, the American people probably share my concern that we have a system-wide outage when I'm asking questions about UFOs. And whether it's the Chinese or the Russians or it's actually people in other places. So let's try to ask this UFO a question again and see if the systems will hold up. Undersecretary Mccord, there's been a lot of discussion recently regarding unidentified aerial phenomena, UAPs, harassing U.S. Navy pilots, and exhibiting technological advancements far beyond our current capabilities. The Senate Intelligence Committee voted to require U.S. intelligence agencies and DoD to compile a detailed public analysis of all information collected on UAPs. Additionally, a former top Pentagon intelligence official said the report could range from revealing an unknown threat or military vulnerability to there have been probes visiting our planet, or anything in between. Another top Pentagon official said that dozens of UFOs appear to have carried out some kind of reconnaissance or surveillance of our nuclear technology and weapons. The UAP task force at DoD has stated its intention to release an unclassified report on this matter by Friday. Will the report provide the American people with answers on how we plan to continue investigating and counter these phenomena?
I'm familiar with the issue, and I understand that the report is, as you describe, imminent. My colleague, the Undersecretary for Intelligence and Security, I know is going to be reviewing, or has reviewed, or is reviewing that report this week. And so if the committee does not receive that report or does not receive that information, we commit on behalf of the department to get that to you. Again, I'm not personally going to be chopping on that report as the CFO, but I am aware that it is moving and it has been discussed with DoD officials that are in the intelligence area.
Do you believe this report will reveal any serious national security threats that the American people should be aware of?
I can't say at this time. I've not been briefed on the report myself, but I do understand that in the intelligence channels, both in the Director of National Intelligence and then in the Intelligence Undersecretary of Defense Department, it is being reviewed and it is expected to be released very soon, as you described.
There's a lot of interest, and even more interest as the days get closer. I'll go back to my question on Israel, since it was cut out during the feed as well. But Undersecretary Mccord, Israel is one of America's most important allies and the only democracy in the Middle East. Recently, we've heard from people on the far left, in fact, in the House chambers who reject our support for Israel and even falsely equated Israel with terrorist groups operating in the region. As attacks on people of the Jewish faith rise around the globe, it's never been more important for us to support Israel. Wouldn't you agree?
Yes, Congressman. Secretary Austin recently met with the Israeli defense minister, and they discussed the most specific current ask on the table or issue on the table, which is their request for assistance from the United States to replenish their inventories of the Iron Dome system that they've used to respond to the rocket attacks. And we in the department are supportive of that request. We're evaluating that request to get information to the Congress on it. And that's, I think, the most near-term and concrete evidence of our existing strong relationship and support for Israel.
Do you have an idea how this budget or the additional cuts proposed by some members will affect this funding?
Well, the funding in the budget that was released a month ago, was prepared over some months and did not anticipate and was not incorporating in any, the recent rocket exchange or recent attacks on Israel. So it wasn't built with that in mind. The funding that we're evaluating was a request from Israel on top of what's in our budget and on top of what Israel might have planned. So it's going to be probably some sort of a supplemental type approach that the Congress would have to consider to address that. It's not. Our budget was built on more of a steady state support for Iron Dome and other Israeli cooperative programs.
Okay, that's unfortunate. The U.S. economy is experiencing the biggest surge in inflation in nearly 13 years. Last month, the Consumer Price Index rose by 5% from a year ago. Producer prices have climbed over 6% in the last 12 months, the fastest increase on record. With prices rising for consumers and producers, can you explain what areas of our defense budget are impacted the most by these increases?
Probably the thing that we noticed the most rapidly in the Defense Department is when fuel prices change, because we're such a large consumer of fuel. And we have sort of two aspects to this. Is between now and the end of the fiscal year, we have the appropriations we have, discretionary appropriations. As you know, the dollar amount is the dollar amount. So if we see inflation tick up between now and September 30th, that's a management problem that I have with the rest of the financial management team to manage us through that. Starting in the new fiscal year, then we have a little more space, and it's something that could be discussed between Congress and the President for FY22. In the future, for the budget that we will build the rest of this fall into the end of this calendar year that will be presented to you next February, then of course you have more options to get updated economic forecast and look at whether the top line should be adjusted because of inflation. But obviously, as you walk back from that to the near term, you don't have really a lot of flexibility, and you have to take more. It's more in the realm of management action. But we're certainly aware, as you say, that inflation concerns are out there, and fuel is probably our most volatile issue in the near term, and perhaps other energy prices that derive from that.
But this budget is focused on a 10-year window, and it does not have the inflation concerns that all the economic statistics are showing. And so I'm glad that you acknowledge that we need to look at that. So thank you, sir.
Gentleman's time has expired. Now recognize the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Doggett, for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, gentlemen, for your service to our country. I've met with enough Gold Star families, enough disabled veterans to appreciate how important it is for President Biden to be focused on the use of diplomacy first and our military as a firm, powerful, but final line of defense, only when our vital national interests are involved and there is not another alternative. It was recognized by General Milley in his testimony yesterday that many of the threats to our families are not from abroad, but from within. When he asked the question, what is it that caused thousands of people to assault this building and try to overturn the Constitution of the United States of America? Sadly, so many of our Republican colleagues, including those who are near hysterical this morning, want to disregard that. One Republican colleague has even suggested that this serious internal threat might have just been mistaken for tourists. There are a number of provisions in your budget that I applaud, beginning with the removal of this budget gimmick of the Overseas Contingency Operations Account, or OCO. It is good to see that your budget includes a pay raise for both our service members and the civilian employees that are so important to our defense. And since I represent much of San Antonio, proudly known as Military City, I'm pleased to see the restoration of funds for Camp Bullis and other defense establishments that were wrongly eliminated by President Trump as he defunded our defense for a worthless border wall. And I'm pleased at the continued investment that you make in the best military medicine in the world at BAMSI in San Antonio, healthcare that not only meets the needs of our military, but has broad benefits for the civilian population. In my own hometown of Austin, I'm pleased to see in the budget recognition of the important role of the Army Futures Command, as it has a growing presence and an increased investment in this budget. The engagement of the tech community in Austin and across the country is very important to our national security. And I salute the work of the Army Futures Command in preparing us for future threats. Regarding the nonsense that we've heard this morning that in attacking the budget of President Trump on defense, President Biden on defense, that he is somehow weaker than President Trump, one need only look at the last few months of this administration to recognize how much safer we are today than in the disastrous 4 years of the Trump administration. We no longer having a president who tells us because of a few love letters that we don't face a threat from North Korea. We don't have a president who's abandoning suddenly our allies as President Trump did with the Kurds. And unfortunately, unlike President Bush, he's not contemplating a totally unjustified invasion of another country at a likely cost of more than $1 trillion and the loss of so many precious lives. There can be no doubt that American families are safer today than they were a year ago when President Trump devoted his effort to attacking our military allies and appeasing our adversaries. You know, with the changes in our deployments overseas, one might expect that we would have a peace dividend reflected in this budget, but that never seems to happen. Mr. Mccord, let me just ask you, isn't it true that over the last couple of decades, the Defense Department budget has soared by over 50%?
Congressman, thank you for your question, and I just want to also commend you for, and agree with you that Brooke Army Medical Center is just a important national asset for us. The defense budget, if you want to take probably the most notable delineation is pre-9/11, post-9/11. It was about $300 billion pre-9/11. So just in purely nominal terms, you're correct. It has more than doubled in 20 years. Of course, inflation, with taking inflation into account, the increase would be much less. But
how does it compare? How does our defense budget compare with that of Russia and China?
It is larger than either of theirs. As others have noted in other hearings, there are some real comparability problems because we have a high-quality force, volunteers that we compensate at market rates, and they do not. But
our budget overwhelms the budget of both our adversaries, Russia and China, and almost all the countries of the world already right now, doesn't it?
We certainly have the largest defense budget in the world as measured, given that there are comparability problems as we've discussed.
Thank you very much.
The gentleman's time has expired, and now recognize the gentleman from Mississippi, Mr. Kelly, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, witnesses, for being here. First of all, I want to talk just a little bit about those comparability problems. When they have a whole of government and communist or socialist form of governments, they have lots of other things that go into a defense budget, whether it be cyber or other things that are not included in ours that are completely separate. So it's really hard to compare apples and oranges. Agreed?
That's correct, and I think you touch on another important point that I think that was central to both the national defense strategy and a national security strategy is that we're in a competition.
Yeah, let me get to my next question.
Government tools, not just military tools.
In the 1930s, we had similarly situated folks. We had a rise in Germany, a rise in Japan. We had similarly situated folks in the United States who were advocating to cut our defense budget because we didn't need it. We didn't need to be able to project power. We didn't need to show strength through a strong military. And that resulted in 1941, December the 7th, in an attack on Pearl Harbor, and that drug us into a war. I believe in peace through strength. I do not believe in war, although I've chosen to defend this nation. I believe that's what we should be, a defense, but peace through strength. Fox Connor, Major General Fox Connor, Chief of Staff to General Pershing in World War I, warned Congress then that it was looming that if we did not invest in our military, that the result would be another world war. And that's what we got. I don't want that. That's why we must be. So in this budget, although we're calling it an increase, I would argue that it is a modest 1.3% increase against the commission's recommendation, bipartisan, that said we should be 3 to 5% real growth every year. We're cutting $2.8 billion in old equipment or in equipment, with the majority coming from the Navy and the Air Force. We're supposed to be redirecting on China and Russia, which requires Navy and strategic air, yet we're cutting those programs. Understand this in this budget. It is a cut. We're doing away with OCO. You can call it what you want. There's $617 million that are going into green stuff. The last time we got promised a green fleet by President Obama that said it would be completely done by 2020, and it still doesn't exist, and we have no idea how much it cost America to do something that didn't produce anything. Not being prepared, just so you understand, creates a huge cost in both lives and treasure of the United States of America. With that being said, tell me how we are impacting our industrial base by cutting DDGs that should be built. The last time we did that, it cost us $2 billion to build a ship that was $1 billion before we delayed it a year. Tell us what the cost to the industrial base and to our defense. How much more is it going to cost us because we're delaying these budgets to buy new equipment?
Congressman, let me briefly respond and toss it to the Admiral, who can give you more detail on this. But the understanding in the department is that the industrial base is backlogged on the DDG in particular, to the point that we could have the ship in the budget this year or next year. It would deliver at the same time, and so the impact was not assessed to be significant. But let me ask him to give more detail.
Yes, I would just add that as we look at the fleet we have now and the fleet that, we're trying to kind of get to a more hybrid fleet. The makeup of that fleet is going to take a little time to get to. As we look this year, in particular in 22, I believe we have, we're bringing in 17 ships. We're taking a few out, as you already said. But clearly, one of the things we have to get at is how do we get to a more distributed, connected fleet that can, make it the adversaries.
Taking my time back, I want you to understand, taking that DDG as part of the integral air defense and against missile systems that we need, yet we're taking one off the table, which is with the Aegis system and other things, is really important. The final thing I just asked you guys to do, and I brought this up with Chairman Milley and Defense Secretary Austin yesterday, please make sure we reimburse our Guard and Reserve. Our men and women have given too much to the nation over the last year to have their Guard drills canceled at the end of this calendar year because we don't have the money to pay them for their COVID response, hurricane response, wildfire response, border response. I've got 155 BCT right now in the desert in California training. We owe them the $500 million we used to defend this capital. Thank you. Now yield back.
Chairman,
comment?
if
Yes, go ahead.
if I could respond and comment, yes, I agree with that. The department supports the supplemental that the House passed for the $520 million. We do need those funds, although the Defense Department budget is much larger than that. The Guards is not. They cannot accommodate those capital security costs. And within weeks of this hearing, they're going to have to start notifying people of canceling drills in the fourth quarter if we don't have a clear way ahead on reimbursing those costs. So we support the House for moving on that, and certainly would urge the Senate to follow in your footsteps.
Great. Thank you for that response. Gentleman's time has expired, and I recognize the gentlewoman from Illinois, Ms. Schakowsky, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thank you to the witnesses. Really appreciate your being here and your service. Pretty much since I've been in Congress, which is quite 22 years, I have raised concerns about the costs of private military contractors. A 2017 report by the department's own Cost Assessment and Program Evaluation Office found that these contractors often cost far more than DoD civilian employees. An additional study that was done by the Sustainable Defense Task Force estimated that currently curtailing the contractors' workforce by even 15% could save over $20 billion a year. Unfortunately, the data that DoD used to manage the labor costs is deteriorating. A February government the GAO report tells us that the DoD new system for collecting the data about the employees does not include what was in the previous system, including direct labor costs associated with contractor workforce. And this data is essential for analyzing the right workforce mix of military, civilian, and contractors. So, Undersecretary McCord, what are you doing to improve labor cost data collection, and how do you plan to use the data to control the cost of private military contractors?
Thank you, Congressman. There's two issues here. I think there's the policy issue of when there are cuts imposed, as there have been in defense authorization bills on headquarters staff in particular, there's an impetus to move to contractors because you're told to cut your government staff, whether military or civilian. So there's that. That's a policy problem we struggle with. That's where you have flexibility, so that's the direction people go in, as you say, then that brings you, but to the cost issue, have you really saved any money when you squeeze the government workforce, but the contractor workforce is sort of considered separately? The data issue, I'd have to get back to you for the record on which system you're talking about and what are the way aheads on that, but it has been a struggle, both counting service contractor costs more generally, as well as the the cost compared to government civilians. But I'll have to take for the record what are the deliverables that we might owe you.
I mean, there's certainly been problems in just figuring out what the defense budget is. Have you been passing audits?
The department entered into a full move as I was leaving and moving into the last administration and now coming back from audits of the Army, Navy, Air Force separately, different components separately, to a full department audit. We have not gotten a clean opinion, as I'm sure you're aware, on that audit. But we are in the full audit regime, but we have not gotten a clean opinion yet.
I wanted to ask about climate change. Many national security experts and members of the military have stated that climate change is a, quote, threat multiplier. Yet we still see the Department of Defense as the world's largest institutional user of petroleum and the world's single largest institutional producer of greenhouse gases. What are we doing about that?
As you say, we are the world's preeminent global power, so we do operate in a global way in which no other military does. We do consume more energy to accomplish that. There are initiatives underway on both the installation side of the energy that's consumed at fixed places at bases and at bases and shipyards and such, and then there's the energy in motion, as you describe it. There are initiatives primarily at this point, I think, more on the vehicle side, which is the easiest place to make progress. On the air side, which is where most of the energy is consumed, that's going to be the harder challenge.
Okay, I'm just a little concerned that what you're saying is that addressing the issue of our carbon footprint is simply really not a priority, And I think it's really important that we look for ways not to diminish our power, that is, as a nation, but to reduce our use of carbon emissions. So I yield back.
Congressman, I would just say, if I conveyed the impression it's not a priority, that's not what I misspoke. I'm just saying it's technically harder to address the jet fuel issue than it is to address vehicles.
I hear that. Thank you.
Gentlewoman's time has expired, and now I recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. McClintock, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Admiral Boxall, there's growing alarm by the military community in my district over what appears to be the military's fixation on social engineering, personal pronouns, critical race theory, gender reassignment surgery, maternity flight suits, and the private political beliefs of our soldiers and sailors. I asked one retired Navy captain, what would he suggest I ask you? He had 3 questions. What are you doing to restore the discipline of seamanship so our ships don't collide? What are you doing to restore mission and fighting purpose so that whether confronted by Iranian gunboats or the coronavirus, the first impulse of our commanders is not to surrender? What are you doing to assure the American taxpayer that every dollar is devoted to a Navy that is ready and willing to fight?
Thank you, Congressman. I can tell you on the first question, what are we doing to restore discipline? I mean, I believe we have incredibly strong discipline in the military writ large. I mean, the recent deployments we had.
Well, when Iranian gunboat, when our forces surrender when a shot's fired across their bow by an Iranian gunboat, I hardly think that that statement's accurate.
Well, with all due respect, sir, I think, again, this was some time ago. There are
When
going
an
to be...
aircraft carrier commander has an outbreak of COVID on his ship and sends through non-secure channels that he can't engage in combat because he has some COVID cases, again, that statement doesn't ring true to me.
Sir, again, I'm just going to tell you that my experience I can speak to is as both a carrier strike group commander, as a ship captain, 2 different cases, and my day-to-day involvement for 37 years almost with our forces is that I believe we have a very strong discipline.
Okay, that's an opinion. What metrics do you use to determine readiness and lethality?
We actually use a lot of different readiness. We have short-term, near-term readiness metrics that we use. We evaluate. Well, we look at ships' readiness rates. We look at aircraft readiness rates. We look at how
are we doing?
Well, generally, most have been improving very steadily in different areas, and as is usually the case.
I've heard reports that we have a large percentage of aircraft and ships that are simply not combat ready, particularly aircraft.
Sir, we've actually made incredible progress with aircraft.
What is incredible progress?
Well, the Commander of Naval Air Forces Pacific, for example, has recently instituted an implementation plan for a readiness of his aircraft.
I'd like to get the figures for aircraft readiness and for ship readiness of now, 5 years ago, and 10 years ago. Can you get that for me?
Those are very broad statistics. We have a series of different readiness metrics, but we will work with your office to get you exactly what you need.
What do you think is the greatest threat facing our country?
As a military person, obviously, we're concerned about the growth of the adversaries, China, Russia, the rise of North Korea. I mean, these are.
I'm glad to hear that. I was afraid you were going to say climate change. That's what the president told us he was being advised. Mr. McCord, the Chinese military is growing very rapidly relative to ours, yet we're spending 3 times more for our military than China is for its military. That sounds like a catastrophic management failure. How do you explain spending 3 times more than China while China's gaining ground on us at such an alarming rate? You said in response to Mr. Kelly that, well, it's because we take better care of our people. Well, if our people end up in a war against an enemy that is vastly better equipped and prepared, it's going to end very badly for our people and for our country.
I agree that's the place we don't want to end up. Our military, their military is not vastly superior to ours. Ours is superior to
theirs.
No,
but they are making rapid gains on us. I don't think there's any question about that.
That's correct.
And it will only be a few years. And it will only be a few years until we are there at the current rate. And yet we're spending 3 times more for our military than they are for theirs.
We do spend more.
There's a bang for the buck problem there that's pretty frightening.
Well, there's, as I said, the one reason, as we described, is that because we have higher quality people and we compensate
let
them.
me
The other is that we are a global power. China is not
Well, let me ask
project
you this,
power in Europe
how
and
much
other
do you
places where
spend
we
for
do.
your green energy programs?
There are about $600 million in the budget out of $700 billion for climate programs.
What does a gallon of synthetic fuel for our jets cost?
I'd have to get that for the record.
Can you give me a rough estimate?
No, I can't.
Okay, well, let me ask you this. How much does a gallon of conventional fuel cost?
I don't have the figures in front of me. We don't buy, of course, conventional fuel for our jets.
Is the magnitude about 3 or 4 times?
I'd have to get that for the record for you.
Gentleman's time has expired, and now recognize the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Kildee, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and for our witnesses, thank you for being here. I represent, rather proudly represent, a small community in northern Michigan called Oscoda. It was, for a long time, the home to B-52s at the Wurtsmith Air Force Base, which closed a couple of decades ago, nearly 30 years ago. The residents of that small community continue to live with some of the consequences of the Air Force presence there, and it's in the form of toxic PFAS chemicals. I'm sure this is a subject that you've heard a lot about. These chemicals have been linked to cancer, to thyroid disease, and it has been in the drinking water, in the groundwater in Oscoda because of the use of AFFF in training and in fires at that base. The community has organized itself. There's an organization called Need Our Water. They deserve an awful lot of credit for bringing this subject to the attention of policymakers. They were talking about PFAS before anybody could even spell it. And their desire is to hold polluters accountable. Of course, that's something we all believe in. In Congress, I've been working on this subject for a few years since it was brought to my attention. I co-chair a bipartisan task force, the Congressional PFAS Task Force, along with Congressman Brian Fitzpatrick of Pennsylvania. And we brought Democrats and Republicans together on this issue, and we've been able to address it. But, you know, as we know, this town that I represent, Oscoda, it's not alone. Our task force has about 60 members because they're hearing from their residents about PFAS contamination. And we know that a lot of the PFAS contamination is traceable to DOD installations. About 300 DOD installations have confirmed PFAS in the groundwater. So this is an issue that is only going to get more serious and only going to require more attention. Just this week, the GAO issued a report that concluded the DOD will have to significantly increase spending to clean up current and former DOD installations that are contaminated with PFAS. So, Mr. Mccord, in light of this report, I'm curious as to why the DOD request this year is for less money for environmental remediation this year than for last year, given the fact that this issue alone is one that is going to demand significantly more investment in cleanup.
Congressman, I agree. The department recognizes this is a serious issue and a long-term issue, that we are probably closer to the beginning than the end. My understanding is we have about a $2 billion liability on our books right now for the future cost of this, but we understand that that figure is probably going to increase. The budget request for this year is intended to fully fund what we are able to do this year. I believe it is less than what Congress appropriated last year, although not less, I think, than what we've been requesting. The phase that we're in, as I understand it, is that we have to continue characterizing it. I believe there's over 600 bases, of which yours is one, that have to be characterized under CERCLA. And so that's a process. We have to sort of follow the process, and when we get better characterization of the problems, then the remediation phase will ramp up more significantly. But we certainly do understand that both for communities where service members still are working, as well as BRAC facilities, as you're describing, this is an important issue that I think the department's committed to.
Well, I appreciate that, and I would just point out that I do think maybe down the chain, there's not full communication up the chain, because in the case of Oscoda, and I'm only talking about Oscoda, but I'm going to operate on the assumption that this is the case in other facilities, not Oscoda being a BRAC site. One of the constraints we've had, as we've been able to get more money for cleanup, is this tension between additional study and spending money to do the cleanup. We have a plan to clean up Oscoda. It needs to be expanded and accelerated. And so I would only take an issue with the notion that what is being requested is intended to be a reflection of what we can do, because at least in the case of Oscoda, I know with certainty that with more resources, we can do much more quickly. And the issue for any community dealing with this is to get it cleaned up as fast as possible. The health implications continue. The economic impact on these communities are severe. And we need, I think, to be much more aggressive and accelerate our work in this space. So if you can work with us on that, I would certainly appreciate it. Thank you.
Gentleman's time has expired, and now recognize the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Smucker, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. McCord and Vice Admiral Boxall, for being here. And thank you both for your service as well. Mr. McCord, we've briefly touched on the idea of investing, ensuring that State Department and diplomacy is fully funded to result in maybe less funding for DoD. There's also, I want to ask you, in your testimony, you introduced, I think, a new emphasis or concept by the administration linking foreign and domestic policy and spending. You say the administration is moving away from traditional distinctions between foreign and domestic policy. You say President Biden believes that domestic renewal will be key to bolstering the department's ability to defend the country. Does that mean, do you believe that means that funds that had traditionally been allocated for DoD were now diverted to domestic programs instead?
Thank you. No, my point was more that the president believes, and I agree, that we need a strong economy to underwrite everything that we do, diplomacy, military strength. So that's the definition to think of security that he started, economic strength. And then I would say the second aspect of that is issues, COVID has really highlighted this, the supply chain issues that affect military, affect non-military issues, microelectronics, the issue, for example, of car makers not being able to get chips because they're only made in one place, are cross defense and non-defense issues. So those issues, I think, he views those as increasing in significance.
Talking about domestic policy, do you believe that open borders pose a threat to our domestic security, our national security?
I think borders are a security issue. Yes.
Are you concerned about the individuals from multiple dozens of countries, over 60 countries, including some of those countries on the terrorist watch list, have come across the border and have been apprehended, and we don't know who else is coming? Does that concern you?
I would agree that who crosses our border is an issue for our country. Every country should have visibility over what's happening, and
So do you have any concern that the administration's open border policies can be exploited by foreign terrorists currently, today?
I can't speak to how well the Department of Homeland Security is carrying out its missions under current policies, but that is their role, and the Department of Defense role is more limited supporting role.
But that would be a concern to you?
If the Department of Homeland Security is not meeting their mission, that would be. That would be an issue, again, of rebalancing as to whether or not different agencies have what they need.
Yeah, there are many of us who believe that the administration has not properly identified the crisis at the border. Vice President Harris has now said she'll be visiting the border tomorrow, after 92 days after being appointed as the border czar. Do you think that will result in better border policy that will protect the nation's security?
I believe that the border and immigration issues, which have been combined, I think, as a large problem that Congress and the presidents have wrestled with for decades, remain a difficult issue for us.
Well, certainly it's been
nation.
made much more difficult by this administration's policies. I want to just touch on another one. I was interested to note the chairman mentioned in his opening statement that 2 out of 3 of our bases are threatened by climate change, and I wondered if you would agree with that, and how would you come to that position?
I think the main reason that we have an issue, one of the main reasons we have a particular sensitivity to climate change in the military is that after World War II, our military, which was distributed differently prior to then, moved to the coast to a large extent along, you know, the South and the West in particular.
So do you think that 2 out of 3 are threatened by climate change?
I couldn't give you the exact number because it depends whether you count every guard recruiting station as an
and
installation.
I'm sorry to cut you off, but like, would you rank that compared to the threat from China or Russia, or just rank it compared to our top 10 threats?
Climate change is important because it affects the environment we operate in, as well as it acts on us as military people in terms of, you know, the health of our bases and the billions of dollars of damage that we've had. China is a different aspect in terms of a global competitor to us, both inside and outside the defense realm. So both of these are global challenges that cross the defense, non-defense into the broader definition of national security.
So do you think it's a smart investment to redirect funds from addressing immediate threats like cyber attacks, like confronting China, to combating climate change?
I would not characterize our budget as picking one or the other. We have the funding to do both.
Gentleman's time has expired. I now recognize the gentleman from Nevada, Mr. Horsford, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to our witnesses for your service and for your testimony today. Last week, I asked General Brown about the Air Force's plans to end procurement of the MQ-9 Reaper. As I'm sure you know, the MQ-9 plays a critical role in my district. Creech Air Force Base is the hub for global ISR and unmanned hunter-killer operations in support of combat commanders. The airmen of Creech Air Force Base play an increasingly important role in protecting the homeland as we shift to exclusively over-the-horizon operations in Afghanistan. For the second year in a row, General McKenzie's #1 request was for an additional $53 million in funding for the MQ-9. He said that the planned Air Force MQ-9's reductions, quote, greatly increases risk to deployed and redeploying forces. He went on to say that combined with our much smaller ground force presence in Afghanistan, Iraq, and Syria, MQ-9 reductions would, quote, substantially reduce CENTCOM's ability to combat ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and other terrorist groups. I'm concerned by this clear disconnect between the clearly articulated needs of the combatant commander and the Air Force's planned reductions. In response to my question last week, General Brown indicated that continued procurement of the MQ-9 platform, even at the modest FY21 enacted level, would risk the development of next generation ISR capabilities. In the context of the entire FY 2022 budget request, the $53 million that's requested by General McKenzie, or even the enacted level of FY21 MQ-9 procurement of $343 million seems like a small price to pay for assured over-the-horizon access in Afghanistan. Given the savings the department will realize due to the Afghanistan withdrawal, I don't understand why we shouldn't make this investment in maintaining our over-the-horizon access in the near to midterm. Under Secretary Mccord, does the Department of Defense support General McKenzie's request for additional MQ-9 funding?
As with many other programs, what's in the budget represents our highest priorities, and commanders are invited to identify lower priorities that did not make the budget that they still think are worthy of consideration, and Congress requests that those be provided, and they are. I would say that I'll ask Admiral Boxall to speak about this in more detail because he has greater expertise, but over the horizon is going to be a challenge, I think, no matter how many assets you have just because of the distances
I'll
as we leave
refrain.
Afghanistan.
It was a pretty simple yes or no response. Do you believe that the continued MQ-9 procurement necessary to meet CENTCOM's over-the-horizon requirements would endanger ongoing efforts to develop and field next-generation ISR capabilities?
I think the overarching issue that you're getting at, which the Chief of Staff probably is what was addressing with you, is that these are not the assets most suited to the near peer competition that we're looking at in the future, and therefore you have to at some point move away from things that may work well in relatively uncontested environments that are not more survivable in a higher end threat.
Yeah, we have about almost 300 MQ-9s in inventory right now. The driver for the lines that we're using in the Middle East right now really have more to do with the 150 or so people per line that it takes to operate those. General McKenzie's concerns are very valid, and we certainly respect those, but we can meet those needs as the commander requests through their allocation requests through the global force management process. So we feel very confident that while we have to make difficult choices along the way, we need something that will get after the ISR needs for the future higher threat environments that we're going to face. MQ-9s will be part of that in some way as we transition, but again, this will be something that we'll have to continually monitor and look to how better to use those MQ-9s with a less manpower intensive and perhaps a more AI-driven ability through our ISR information gathering.
Well, I will come back to this question both here and on the House Armed Services Committee. So please look forward to working with your team and the Air Force to ensure CENTCOM has the resources that they need given our reduced ground presence in the region. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired, and now recognize the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Klein, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank our witnesses for being here. Mr. Undersecretary McCord and Vice Admiral Boxall, thank you for joining the Budget Committee today to review the DoD's proposed budget, and thank you for your service as well. One of the issues that I'm most concerned with is our readiness to compete with our adversaries, and I'm particularly concerned with whether this budget proposal does prepare us to meet these challenges. Mr. Undersecretary, I'll start with you. What is the percentage increase in defense spending in the President's budget?
As I think we've described, the percentage increase is about 1.6% from last year, and in real terms, it's about 20% over the last 4 or 5 years.
Right. Is it true that this is one of the smallest increases of any federal department and does not even keep up with inflation?
It is a smaller increase in some departments if you look just compared to last year, but compared over a longer period, Defense have basically already got its baseline increase prior to this year.
Right. We recognize the accomplishments of the last administration in boosting defense spending. The FY22 request for national defense of $753 billion is only 1.6% higher than last fiscal year's enacted level. As you stated, this growth increase is less than what CBO projected for inflation. Vice Admiral, can the Department of Defense execute the requirements set forth by the most recent national defense strategy at this funding level?
Thank you, Congressman. The chairman has been very clear that we have the resources we need to defend this country and to continue to make those investments. The challenge for us is always going to be one of risk. At any funding level, we have to kind of make difficult trades. And so this budget, we believe, and he also has communicated that we are moving into the capability sets that we need. So we are kind of in a transition to the change in the character of war, and the chairman believes that we are making those significant investments. You heard about the RDT&E, the long-range fires, hypersonics, AI, space. A lot of these new capabilities are going to be needed. So the answer is yes.
Well, in addition to changes in technology and the like, would this funding level require the DoD to rethink and potentially change the national defense strategy?
I will, obviously, that defense strategy is a function of the policy of the secretary. We certainly believe that we always have to look at the changes to strategy. We've already are in the process of redoing the strategy right now. We think that's a correct follow-on to the 2018 National Defense Strategy. So
the answer is yes.
Yes.
Okay.
I would just add, Congressman, the Secretary is required by law to do his own strategy assessment, and that the law is sort of structured that every new administration will be required to do so, and that's underway.
But that this funding reduction would require a shift and a change, and that was the question that I asked and was answered. Thank
That's
you.
not necessarily the case, no.
Okay, it's good to know you can do more with less. Last week, President Biden met with President Vladimir Putin on the world stage. Biden said he handed Putin a list of 16 sectors of critical infrastructure which are quote-unquote off limits for cyber attacks. We believe that everything should be off limits from attacks of any kind from the Kremlin. Given that the president did not make this clear, it's even more important to invest in safeguarding our DoD networks and information systems. How does this budget build on the progress made in the military's cyber operations?
This budget continues to invest in a very effective cyber command, which we already have. As I think you are aware, the most recent vulnerabilities have been on the non-defense side, and that stretches into the homeland security and even the private sector's areas of responsibility. That's probably where our greatest challenges lie. Our networks have been pretty good with respect to solar winds, and any number of recent attacks have not really been a problem for DoD as they have been so much for other actors.
Okay. The single biggest reduction in proposed year-over-year cyber funding request appears to be an overseas hunt-forward cyber ops with a $284.4 million cut down to $147.2 million in FY22 versus a requested $431 million last year. What is hunt forward and why is it no longer important?
Sir, I would say that hunt forward operations is the ability of the cyber teams to go forward with the permission of our allies to find threats to our networks abroad before they, in fact, invade our own networks. The money you're seeing here, I don't know the specific dollar amount, but what we also have added is 4 cyber mission teams that will assist in further improving. We actually did a $400 million increase in cyber funding from $10 billion up to $10.4, specifically to get after some of the issues you have there. Hunt forward operations specifically, because they are, at the request of another government, is something that, obviously we will continue to fund out of those teams that we help to perform those missions.
Thank you.
Gentleman's time has expired. Now recognize the gentlewoman from California, Ms. Lee, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Undersecretary Mccord, for being with us today. A couple things. First of all, for those who have made comments regarding the so-called far left in terms of spending reduction, I just want to say a couple of things with regard to our support for our troops, our support for our national security and our readiness. In no way have we presented any cuts that would tamper with any of our national security needs, especially as it relates to our troops. And in fact, we want to make sure that our troops are fully supported, which we have not done in the past. So I wanted to clarify that for the record. I'm the daughter of a military officer, 25 years, served in 2 wars, and there is no way that I would even think of going into trying to reduce defense spending that would hurt or harm our national security or our troops. For 3 decades now, though, the federal agencies have been required to pass financial audits under Secretary Mccord. Now, last year we heard that we were told that an audit would be ready from the Defense Department by 2027. Now we're hearing the goal is 2028. And I want to know how we justify these increases in spending poured into the financial system that cannot pass an audit or that won't conduct an audit per required by law. Secondly, I would like to just ask you with regard to a 2016 study by the Defense Business Board, which identified $125 billion in administrative waste at the Pentagon. The report was then shelved. And I wanted to find out and ask you, do you intend to revisit any of the findings of this study to look for savings? And do you plan to make these public? And finally, let me just ask you this. Now, we know that the department continues to overpay for spare parts. Past overcharges have included $2,286 for landing gear that should have cost $10, paying $71 for a pen that should have cost less than a nickel, and paying $8,124 for a bevel gear that should have cost $445. all of this was during the previous administrations. The department tried to prevent, I know under the Obama administration, tried to prevent these overcharges in seeking a revision to the definition of commercial terms. So is there something that you consider submitting and supporting again to prevent taxpayer, quite frankly, ripoffs? And there again, we're talking about savings as it relates to waste, fraud, and abuse.
Thank you. Let me address your three questions in order. On the audit, shortly before I was confirmed, I believe the senior career officials testified before the House Armed Services Committee with the date of the 2027 date that you mentioned. I've not had a chance in my brief time in office here to confer with them and understand the rationale for those dates and whether I think it's just whether it's accurate, whether it could be faster, whether it would be slower. So I need to get back, work with my team, and then get back to the Congress on whether or not that date should be reassessed. I certainly understand the frustration that the department has, given our scope and our size, has had such a struggle with this issue, but we are committed to getting it right. On the Defense Business Board study, I am familiar with that. I believe we're talking about the same study. The problem that the department had at the time with it was at such a generic level that you should be able to save money on functions like human resources and information technology without any specific actionable recommendations. I think is the reason that the Deputy Secretary of Work at the time felt that it was not a useful report for us. That doesn't mean that we're not looking at the individual aspects of that for savings. Of course we are. Finally, on the spare parts, Defense Contract Audit Agency, which reports to me, has a particular mission to focus on non-commercial items, on the more military unique things. That's where the Defense Contract Audit Agency focus goes. If something's a commercial item, that's a different challenge for us. If something was maybe mischaracterized or was improperly priced as a commercial item, but we focus on the higher value military unique contracts as our first priority in terms of contract auditing for fair pricing.
Okay, thanks, Mr. Undersecretary. And I just wanted to close by saying that we know that, and it's unfortunate that the Pentagon has never been able to not only put forth an audit, but pass an audit. The billions of dollars in waste, fraud, and abuse are very clear. They've been documented by very credible organizations which know and follow defense spending. And so for those who think that reasonable reductions in defense spending are just considerations of the far left, I want you to know that there are billions of dollars in waste, fraud, and abuse in the Pentagon, which definitely could be positioned or reprogrammed for our troops and for other areas in terms of domestic spending that this country desperately needs. And so thank you again very much for your responses.
Gentlewoman's time has expired. I now recognize the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Carter, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank both of you for being here. This is extremely important discussion, and we appreciate your participation. Gentleman, Colin Powell has said the military was the only institution in America where, and I quote, "the only thing that counted was courage, where the color of your guts and the color of your blood was more important than the color of your skin," unquote. With that in mind, do teachings like critical race theory that is incredibly divisive and propose, and I quote again, "the only remedy to past discrimination is present discrimination. The only remedy to present discrimination is future discrimination," unquote. Look, I'm all for reading and considering opposing views, and I think we all agree with that. As the chairman of the Joint Chiefs has said, but this is intentionally divisive. And my question, Mr. Undersecretary, for you is, how do you expect a soldier or a sailor to fight for this country when they're being taught that it's not worth fighting for?
Thank you. It's not my understanding is that we are not teaching people critical race theory. We're not, as you describe, things are being, offered up to consider, but not being imposed on people as official department policy to think a certain way.
Are we funding that in any way at all?
Not that I'm aware of.
It's my understanding that this is on recommended reading, and it's even being taught in some classes at some of our institutions. some of our military institutions.
It's quite possible that books are on reading lists. Yes, that doesn't mean that it's department policy to make people believe a certain way.
I understand that, but is it being taught? That's my question. And is it being financed to be taught?
I would have to get back to you for the record of what's being
Can you
taught.
do
I'm not
that
in
for me,
charge of
please?
professional
Can you get
military
back to me
education.
on the record for that?
Certainly.
I'd appreciate that very much. If indeed, Mr. Undersecretary, this is the case, how would that affect our future recruitment of an all-volunteer force if this type of teaching to our children to hate America and it's not worth fighting for? What impact do you think that would have?
I'm sorry, are you asking about if it's taught in the military or if it's taught elsewhere?
If this is the type of reading that we're recommending, that our military is recommending, if this is being taught, and you're going to find that out and you're going to respond to me in writing as if it is or if it isn't, but if it is being taught, do you think this would have an impact on us trying to recruit future volunteers?
I believe that Secretary Austin's priority is to make sure that the force is inclusive and that the leadership of the force reflects the diversity that's already in the force. So I think that we're actually moving in a good direction on this. I don't know that the issue you're describing will move the needle one way or the other on who chooses to join the force. It's a complex issue, as you know. Recruiting and retention is a specialized field, and we compete with private sector. The services compete with each other, so it's certainly a complex challenge.
So we certainly should be concerned about what's being taught in our military institutions and what is being taught in our military and what is being recommended for them to read. Would you agree with that if recruiting, as you indicate, is so very important?
Again, I don't know that what's being taught at West Point or some other place
But my
is
question
crucial
is
to this issue.
My question is, wouldn't it be important for us to make sure that we're not including things such as this in our recommended reading? Wouldn't it be very important for us in the future in the future recruitment of volunteers to make sure that we're making it clear that this country is worth fighting for and that we're not indeed proposing divisive material like critical race theory?
I certainly agree this country's worth fighting for, and I don't believe the department teaches otherwise.
Okay. It's my understanding that according to a September 2020 memo, executive agencies spent millions of dollars on training, claimed that there was racism embedded in the belief that America is the land of opportunity, or the belief that the most qualified person should receive a job, and other tenets of what is known as critical race theory. Do you know how much the Department of Defense has spent on this type of teaching, or if they have at all?
I would have to get back to you for the record on whether there is, on particular costs, a particular type of training or reading.
Okay. I appreciate your willingness to get back with me, Mr. Undersecretary. I appreciate your willingness to answer these questions. I look forward, great anticipation, your written response to this. Thank you, sir, and I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. I now recognize the gentlewoman from California, Ms. Chu, for 5 minutes.
Undersecretary McCord, I'm concerned that in the 150-page overview of the defense budget for fiscal year 22, the word hazing does not appear anywhere. This is troubling because we know that hazing has been a persistent problem in the ranks, which I know firsthand. In 2011, my nephew, Marine Lance Corporal Harry Liu, was a victim of hazing while stationed in Afghanistan. Under the guise of corrective action, other Marines kicked, punched, and nearly smothered him with sand for several hours until he took his own life. At the same time this happened, Army Private Danny Chen was subject to weeks of abuse from his superiors, who tortured him with physical abuse while yelling racial slurs and insults such as goot, chink, and dragon lady. He took his own life. After Harry's death, I heard from countless service members and their families who reached out to describe truly terrible acts of hazing. I also was able to get amendments in the NDAA for everything from GAO reports to directives for tracking and prevention measures of hazing. But still, despite these directives, little progress has been made. From fiscal year 2018 to 2020, the Army, Navy, and Air Force have not shown any improvements at tracking incidents. The vast majority of reported and substantiated hazing incidents have been reported by the Marine Corps each year. While the Marines have at least a system in place to report and track these incidents, it's clear that other branches have not followed suit. And of course, hazing is not 50 times more prevalent in the Marines, which is the smallest service branch, than in the Army, which is the largest. The problem instead is that up until now, there hasn't been urgency or accountability when it comes to addressing racism and hazing. So could you please talk about the resources in this budget request that will be used to address racism and military hazing? And talk more broadly about how fighting racism and hazing fits into the department's strategy in fiscal year 2022?
First thing I would say, Congresswoman, is I'm certainly, on behalf of the department, sorry for the loss of in your family of your nephew. I understand you have spoken to the Deputy Secretary directly about that case and about our efforts in this area. Secretary Austin, taking care of the people is one of his core tenets, and I think everyone's aware that he has made a big effort to address diversity, equity, and inclusion, and then he has a separate task force on sexual assault. Suicide and hazing are part of this larger effort. They don't get the publicity, I think, that the sexual assault, which has kind of dominated the headlines, especially after the Secretary's recent statement. But I know it is part of the effort writ large in the personnel community. As the CFO, I don't have direct involvement in the training or setting up the programs, but I can certainly get any information for you for the record that you need.
Thank you for that. And Under Secretary McCord, I see that throughout the budget that the administration is turning our national security focus towards countering China. I understand the necessity of protecting our national security, but I also want to ensure that the rights and liberties of Chinese Americans are protected. The Trump administration launched the China Initiative that put immense pressure on the Department of Defense to scrutinize and target Asian Americans, especially those of Chinese descent, based solely on their ethnicity, which has had numerous consequences, including having security clearances denied or revoked. In one instance, a 61-year-old founder of a machinery design company sought a security clearance to work on defense contracts. He immigrated to the US in 1985, earned a doctorate degree, and became a citizen, had 2 daughters born in the US. However, because he was sending money to his 90-year-old father in China, his clearance was denied and his appeal was denied, despite the fact that he was never approached for sensitive information from the Chinese government. So as we view this budget and see proposals to counter the influence of China, can you speak broadly about the importance of protecting the civil liberties of American citizens of Asian and Chinese descent, while also protecting American national interests?
Congressman, I would agree with you that central to what America is about is equal treatment under the law and equal treatment of people, whether they are our employees most especially, but also our contractor partners. So I would agree with you. It is important that we give people equal treatment and equal justice, regardless of their race or ethnicity.
Gentlewoman's time has expired. Now recognize the gentlewoman from Colorado, Ms. Boebert, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Ranking Member Jason Smith, for holding this hearing. Thank you, Vice Admiral Boxall and Undersecretary McCord, for serving our country and taking time today to talk about the Biden administration's defense proposal. The Biden agenda spends big on everything except our national defense. In our ranking member's opening remarks, he mentioned that this administration seeks to defund our military, defund our police, which weakens our safety, our security, and emboldens our enemies. Whether this is at our southern border or to support our men and women in uniform, Biden's budget is light. Under Biden's budget, defense spending is essentially flatlined. Biden's budget would spend more on non-defense discretionary spending than defense discretionary spending. This administration states that climate change is the biggest threat to our national security. I disagree. I would argue Biden's budget is a greater threat to our national security. It distracts from real national security threats like China, Russia, and the southern border being wide open to folks from all over the world pouring into our country illegally. Instead, this budget prioritizes a radical agenda through increasing funding for pandemic preparedness, climate change adaptation, and bringing critical race theory ideologies into our military. Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent to submit a report by General Ed Ebhart and Lieutenant General Ed Anderson on the discussion to move U.S. Space Command into the record.
Without objection.
Thank you. Admiral, thank you for being here today. Keeping in mind the context that I just laid out, I want to now turn to a study by a retired commander of Air Force Space Command and NORAD Northcom and a retired lieutenant general. This study says that the decision to move the U.S. Space Command from Colorado Springs, Colorado to Huntsville, Alabama lacked evidence that cost was a priority. It says that leaving the Space Command in Colorado will save taxpayers more than $1.2 billion and get the command to full mission capability 7 years faster. Those numbers don't even include the cost of building survivable communications in Alabama or incentivizing civilians to move there. Given that the Biden administration did not see fit to increase the defense budget at the rate of inflation, why would we waste $1.2 billion on a project that will delay mission capability 7 years in the newest warfighting domain of space?
Thank you, Congresswoman. I have not read that study. I don't know the details of it or how those numbers were calculated. What I do know is that the Air Force is giving due diligence to the question. I don't know where it stands right now. I think it is. I have not been aware of any of those numbers that are used. So until I have that, I wouldn't be able to comment.
Thank you, Admiral. Since the DoD, IG, and GAO are both investigating the decisions to move Space Command, will DoD also conduct a complete reassessment of the cost during this pause for the investigation?
Again, I'm not familiar on the DoD portion of that, but I will say that cost is one aspect of it. There are a lot of things that go into those studies. Cost is certainly very important. Capability is critically important.
Yes, sir.
So all those.
Thank you, Admiral. I don't mean to cut you short. I'm sorry, my time is short. I do appreciate that, and I think the American people would be served best by a complete reassessment that includes costs and mission readiness. Now, with the time that I have left, I do want to turn to this budget's proposed increase for unconscious bias diversity training by $68 million. So there are taxpayer dollars going to this critical race theory-based training. I have major concerns about spending taxpayer dollars to teach an ideology that undermines the principles of the Constitution our service members have taken an oath to defend. I have written the Secretary of the Navy to stop attempts through Task Force 1 Navy to insert this ideology into training regime for sailors in the U.S. Navy. And I also wrote to the Secretary of the Air Force regarding the removal of Lieutenant Colonel Lomer from his command due to the developing politicized environment in the DoD. This indoctrination and mandatory trainings have been taken too far. My time is up.
The gentlewoman's time has expired. And now recognize the gentlewoman from the U.S. Virgin Islands, Ms. Plaskett, for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for the opportunity to question the witness. And thank you, Undersecretary, for being with us this morning. Wanted to ask you several questions. Many of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle are criticizing this budget proposal for only providing a 1.6%. I'm sorry, is there someone else on the line off? Mr. Chairman, if you would
I don't believe
just
so.
give me time. I'm hearing, okay.
Yeah.
Providing a 1.6% increase for the military, but the Department of Defense is an enormous operation. I think it's important to look deeper than just the top line funding levels. For example, The budget requests a 3.1% increase in military personnel, a 5.2% increase for research and development, and a 2.7% increase for military pay, while decreasing procurement by 5.7%. So my question is to our witness, in your opinion, how should we review the adequacy of the department's requests? What do you hope we look at when we determine the overall funding levels for defense?
I know I would speak for both the Secretary and the Deputy Secretary that the most important thing for Congress to assess is what we're proposing, the details, what we're proposing to spend the money on rather than what it
I'm
adds
sorry,
up
the
to.
witness is on mute.
I'm sorry, can you not hear me, Congresswoman?
Ms. Plaskett, are you able to hear? Yeah,
Okay,
we'll have to pause.
Congresswoman, I'd started to answer your question, but I'm concerned you may not be able to hear me.
We ought to pause for just a minute, please. Yeah, the hearing will be in recess until further notice. Ms. Plaskett, can you hear us now in the hearing room?
Yes, I can.
All right. Well, then, we will resume the hearing. The hearing's now back in order, and Ms. Plaskett, you can continue your questioning.
Thank you. I believe the witness was responding to my question as to how should members of this committee review the adequacy of the department's requests, and how would you hope we would then look to determine the overall funding levels for defense?
Understanding that the Budget Committee has a somewhat different role than the Armed Services and Appropriations Committee, I understand that you would look at the top line as part of your assessment here, and possibly in comparison to the other priorities. I would point out just on that front that we have our discretionary request is basically equal to every other agency's combined. So I feel like we have the resources that we need to do our job. I'm not concerned whether we have a little more or a little less than some other agency, but I understand that's part of the assessment you must make about whether you feel the balance is appropriate. Within our top line is where we really feel like we would like the Congress to focus. As you look at what we're doing, do you think we're on the right path? Do you think we're pursuing the right priorities? If you agree with us on the assessment of what the priorities are, such as concern about the global competition with China, do you think that our programs are moving us in that direction? We think we have a good program and a good story on that, but I think that's where the focus should be.
And I would echo that we would hope that we look at that right balance of readiness, modernization, and procurement. Certainly, those are the criteria that we use to measure the difficult choices that we had to make inside this or any budget. So we would hope that the committee would review that we got those parts of it right, that we believe that we need to modernize the force, we need to get after more important capabilities and restore the readiness that we've kind of had issues with that are continuing to improve, but we need to keep that going with personnel as well. Thank you.
Thank you. And with that readiness and ensuring that our troops are in fact educated and mindful in the same way that you would teach them about the doctrine of communism or socialism or those individuals that we are working against. You would in turn also teach them about those principles and support the American people, such as the Constitution, and such as my colleague does not seem to understand, critical race theory is a legal doctrine, not one that is put forth in schools. And so having sensitive and those troops who understand and are able to adequately support their fellow officers, whether it's in the field, battlefield, or on the ships or anywhere else, would be something that I'm sure our troops are happy to have. One of the last questions I wanted to ask you was that an issue that I have concern about in my district is housing allowance for members of the active Guard Reserve in the Virgin Islands. As you know, members of the Guard on duty in the 50 states currently receive the basic allowance for housing, but members on duty in the Virgin Islands only receive the overseas housing allowance, which is reimbursable allowance and offers less flexibility for members to find housing options that meet their needs. I understand, however, that Hawaii and Alaska are currently considered to be overseas locations while still receiving the basic allowance for housing. As you may be aware, the Virgin Islands National Guard, members of the Guard, its leadership, our governor, have all requested to extend the basic allowance for housing to Guard members serving in the Virgin Islands, as has my office. Does the Department of Defense plan to take any actions, including under its available statutory authority, to extend this to Guardsmen working in the Virgin Islands? Thank you.
Congresswoman, I'm not familiar with the request, if it's on the table with the department to consider how we treat the so-called OHA in the Virgin Islands compared to how Alaska or Hawaii are treated, but we will certainly get back to you.
I would appreciate that. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Gentlewoman yields back. Now recognize the gentlewoman from Iowa, Ms. Henson, for 5 minutes.
And thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing today. I really appreciate the opportunity. Undersecretary Mccord and Vice Admiral Boxall, thank you for your patience and taking all of our questions and being here today. Most importantly, I also want to thank you on behalf of Iowans for your service to our country. You were in a very tough role, and I know that. And I understand what you are doing to help protect everyday American families and Iowa families, and I appreciate that. I do have to start off by saying today that I was disappointed in President's budget request. I believe it's a disservice to you and all the men and women who commit their lives to defending our freedoms. I feel the Department of Defense has been hit time after time since January. First, the announcement to remove the troops from Afghanistan without a clear plan in place to prevent a worsening situation. We've had questions today about the Taliban. We've heard about human rights violations in that country in the worsening situation. And then just recently, on the floors of the House of Representatives, a move to repeal the 2002 AUMF without a replacement plan. These moves would leave our troops in nearby positions, unguarded and vulnerable, and that's unacceptable. Then, of course, I think the most recent blow, and we've heard about it today, is the President's decision to increase the budget by only a mere 1.6%, which we've also heard about today after inflation is actually a budget cut. So in real-world dollars, the Department of Defense will have less money in its fiscal year 22 budget than in this fiscal year 21 budget. But again, before I begin my questions, I want you both to know I'm here to support you. We want to make sure we can defend our country. The work that you carry out at the Department of Defense with taxpayers' resources is absolutely critical to protecting Iowa families. The safety and security of our country is paramount. So my first question today, Vice Admiral Boxall, you mentioned a little bit earlier your concern about China and its threat, developing specific weapons, space capabilities, those areas of concern. Can you elaborate a little bit on some of those areas of concern for people in the room today?
Sure, Congresswoman, thank you. Certainly, my experience over many years of being in the Pacific and also in the building, I've seen the trend, as we all have, of China in both space, hypersonics, missiles growth, and so we worry a lot about that. I mean, that's kind of the trend that we were concerned about, and why this budget gets after a lot of those concerns. This is the first one where we go after some hypersonics, some procurement, and it's also going to require new ways of thinking and fighting against that adversary. So that's one particular. The cyber vulnerabilities of our force is concerning, and you see those. So while we look at the, whatever the number is, clearly inside those priorities from a military standpoint, we're looking for the joint force to get after those capabilities that we feel will shift from the wars that we've seen in the Middle East to the Pacific, and to be able to keep up with a rising China.
And I'd like to also point out, I just saw a news article as we were sitting here a little bit ago, Russia's posturing quite dramatically as well against the West. So that's a growing concern. As we look at the National Defense Strategy, when it's recommending a 3 to 5% increase to keep up with that, I mean, I think everybody's concerned when we're hearing about this 1.6% increase that it's not going to jive with that recommendation. So do you agree with the report? Do you think we need that 3 to 5% increase? Because that's a serious conversation we need to be having.
So obviously, we've seen the 3 to 5% for a while, and our job is to try to get the best joint force we can for whatever the budget is. As far as 3 to 5%, that brings less risk the more money you have into the portfolio. So at any funding level, you're going to incur some risk. I haven't been involved in one budget that I haven't had those difficult discussions. As the funding level is higher, you can get after more things more quickly. As you go lower, you have to divest and change more quickly. So my concern at any budget level are those trade-offs.
So do you believe that with a higher level of funding, that we could be better equipped for our military to handle these ongoing threats that China is posing, that Russia is posing?
More money will lessen the risk, as I just stated.
Okay, I'm concerned about that risk at a 1.6% increase. Another area that I just wanted to touch on that I've heard some conversation about today, it's evident that this priority in this budget is not necessarily the protection of Americans and our interests, but instead it seems really focused on accommodating climate change policies and the agenda of this administration. One thing, being from Iowa, that I would like to point out is that our biofuels industry stands ready to be a partner in this fight. Biofuels are readily available. They're a great alternative energy that would significantly reduce our carbon emissions while bolstering as well American jobs and reducing, again, those carbon emissions while helping our local economies. Have you had any considerations, either of you can answer this question, specifically about the impact of biofuel use perhaps on your carbon footprint at the DoD, since you are such a large consumer of fuels?
I will say that I actually was the carrier striker commander for the Great Green Fleet, and we actually did get underway and operated completely with biofuels for both aircraft, ships, and we learned a lot from that activity. So, we'll continue to evolve those types of lessons as we look at other climate impacting decisions.
Gentlewoman's time has expired, and now recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. Peters, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. McCord and Admiral Boxall, for appearing here today. I do support this budget request in terms of the top line. I think that given the bipartisan support that we brought to increasing the budget over the last 2 years, that this $715 billion is an appropriate amount. As Mr. McCord noted in his prepared remarks, the interim national security guidance from the President clearly articulates the need to make smart and disciplined choices regarding our national defense, responsible use of our military. A lot of the conversation is around the divestment of legacy platforms and realignment of resources allotted to procurement, operations, maintenance, basic research, development, test, and evaluation. I want to first start by saying I share the concern that Mr. Horsford expressed earlier about MQ-9s and MQ-4s, which seem to me to be a much more cost-effective way to handle particularly the ISR issues than some of the other ways. But I wanted to ask also about infrastructure and modernization of commands and infrastructure, particularly projects like the NAVWAR redevelopment effort in San Diego. I want to know if you could explain how the DoD and the services are going to prioritize modernization of infrastructure and what that would mean for something like NAVWAR.
So I did get an opportunity to go out to San Diego and see some of those efforts firsthand.
Lucky you, by the way.
Say again?
Lucky you. It's always good to go to San Diego.
Well, it's always good to get to San Diego. I was only there for a few hours, unfortunately, but I did get an opportunity to get out there and see some of the things that they're doing. We're excited about a lot of the things that are going on out there, but again, I don't know specifically what the requests are, the infrastructure impacts. What I can say is that what we're learning from those types of efforts and get after our joint all-domain command and control issues, which are key and critical to this change to a future joint force, all-domain force.
Sure, and I guess, I mean, we're looking at a project over a long period of time, but obviously you've got assets like NAVWAR that are really critical to the mission and are, let's say, underserved in terms of their own infrastructure and property utilization. I also wanted to mention, follow on something that Mr. Kowski talked about, which was energy. You know, it's interesting that the military, and I agree with my colleague from Iowa about innovation, the military, and particularly the Navy, has always been the big innovator in terms of energy. It went from sails to coal to nuclear, and you mentioned the Great Green Fleet, which I was happy to support when I was a member of the Armed Services Committee. These are changes that are made for operational and security reasons. They're not in any way because the Navy or the Marines are tree huggers. MCAS Miramar in my district is a pioneer in energy microgrids that enhance the command's energy resiliency and reduce the base's footprint. The operational and strategic utility of this project is clear. They reduce an electromagnetic footprint and mitigate the need to rely on supply chains that transport traditional energy sources, and that would be particularly useful overseas. The developments increase the survivability the joint force needs to succeed in a future operating environment characterized by the proliferation of anti-access area denial threats. And so my question to you is, how can Congress support DoD's efforts to address the climate crisis impact while at the same time making the force stronger and more lethal?
Well, to be honest, I'm not really an expert in the types of things. I know we're working very closely. We have a group together, a task force that's been created with the secretary and also with the chairman. We have members on that committee or that task force to get after some of those things. My experiences with demand, certainly operationally, if we can lessen demand for ships or aircraft at sea, or anywhere, then we can certainly allow them to operate more freely, and that certainly is an advantage operationally. So, but as far as other initiatives, it's not my forte. Certainly the task force is looking more closely at that.
Maybe Mr. Cord, you have something.
I would just add that I think the important thing from my perspective is that we be allowed to experiment across a range of things. Fuel cells, for example, are something that allow you to, energy is hard to store, right? Electricity, right. Easy to produce, hard, it has to be transmitted because it can't be stored easily. That's an important aspect. The fuels is another one. the efficiency of the vehicles that we use, and as well as the thought process of looking at how climate change might change the problem sets.
Right.
I'll just reiterate, I agree with you. You touched on an important one, was the logistics footprint that comes with how you use energy is important, especially as you go to a more remote place like Afghanistan.
And
It
one of
can
the
be
most
very
dangerous,
costly.
one of the most dangerous things we do is transport large amounts of petroleum across the desert, and when those convoys are attacked, we lose.
Correct. I remember, I
soldiers.
think, the same case you're talking about from Iraq, that we had to do special coding on fuel trucks because snipers were shooting at the fuel trucks.
Well, let me just encourage it. Mr. Chairman, my time has expired, but I would say it's possible that someone in a room like this a few decades ago would have said, don't spend money on the internet, don't spend money on GPS. That would have been very short-sighted. So I encourage you to continue to innovate in support of the mission, and I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. I now recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. Obernolte, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to both our witnesses for being here on such an important topic. My first question is for Vice Admiral Boxall. You said in your testimony something that I thought was fascinating. You said that we were experiencing the most fundamental shift in the way that battles are fought in the entire history of warfare, which I really think speaks volumes about what we need to do to ensure that America remains competitive when it comes to our military. So I think what you've heard from a large number of us today is some alarm at the fact that the proposal is to decrease defense spending in real dollars, given the fact that the 1.6% projected increase in budget is less than the rate of inflation. So in your opinion, given the fact that we need to fundamentally transform our capabilities in that way, does this budget give you adequate resources to do that?
I believe it does. I think we start the move from where we have been to where we're going in the future. There's a down payment on a lot of things here that are going to matter, and they'll matter more as time goes on. But certainly, as I described earlier to your colleague, we had, we look at this as a function of risk. I mean, how quickly we move and how quickly we can change from the things we used to need to the things we need in the future is really a key in any budget future. But that's really kind of what we think about here from a military standpoint, and we're trying to get after inside of the Joint Force a better way to characterize what those specific changes are going to be. We're throwing the rudder over, if you will, with the idea that we will change into a different place, and how we fight will be very different than how we have been fighting in the past.
Thank you very much for that. And Undersecretary McCord, thank you for being here and recognizing it's a very difficult job that you have. I had a question about the deferred maintenance and infrastructure at our bases. I have the privilege of representing the district in which the 29 Palms Ground Air Marine Corps Station is located. And so I don't know a lot about our bases in other parts of the country and the world, but I know a lot about that one. And I know that in that base, they've been struggling with the issue of wastewater treatment, which seems like a very non-military thing to be worried about, but there's a real need there. There has been for many years. The last Congress appropriated funding to build a new wastewater treatment plant for the base. Unfortunately, by the time the funding was appropriated, the cost of building it had risen, and therefore the money was insufficient, and now it's back on the unfunded priorities list. So I find that very alarming. I hope that that's not the case with bases in other parts of the country. And I'm wondering what the DoD's strategy is going to be to addressing the projects on the unfunded priorities list and making sure that we don't have situations like the one occurring in 29 Palms.
While I'm not familiar with the particular project, I understand the problem that you're stating. It does happen from time to time. There's a range within which, if you're close enough, you can go back to the committees and do what's called a cost variation. But when you get above a certain threshold, it gets, as perhaps in this case, just too hard to do. Unfunded military construction project priorities are something Congress looks at, and something the department looks at as it looks at each next budget. We have a little bit of a glut right now in that we had projects diverted for the border wall, which are competing with all the other unfunded projects. So I think there's maybe a little more of a demand signal on the military construction side than there is otherwise right now. But as we work our way through that backlog, if your wastewater treatment project gets to a life, safety, health of the people working and living there, then that will probably put it in a higher priority situation for action.
Well, thank you. I hope we can work together to try and get that particular problem solved, but also want to highlight the fact that we can't achieve military preparedness if we can't maintain our base facilities. Thank you very much for both of you for being here today. I'll yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back the balance of his time. I now recognize the gentlewoman from Texas, Ms. Jackson Lee, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I think the clock is not correct. Thank you very much. Let me acknowledge your service, Secretary McCord, and as well the service of our Secretary of Defense. Please convey to him my best greetings and our appreciation for his historic service. It is enormously impactful here in this country and also with the new attitude. As you know, Secretary, we have just 5 minutes, and so I am going to ask some yes or no questions and then maybe some that require a little bit more detail. First of all, I want to applaud, as a member of the Military Families Caucus, I want to applaud the 3.1% increase for military personnel. Quickly, I want to know whether or not that is going to result in improved housing for our families, the diminishing of food stamps that many young Army families and other military families have to access, and what does it do for, so I'll let you answer those very quickly. Housing and the use of food stamps by Army personnel because of the lack of resources.
Thank you, Congresswoman. I would say that on the food stamp side, probably the biggest impact in the last year or so has been COVID and the impact it's had on people's outside employment, for example, military spouses. So I think as the getting control of the pandemic, which allows us to grow the economy again, is probably as important as anything we can do specifically within the defense budget. Housing.
Well, is the increase in salary going to help with the diminishing of the food stamp assistance need?
Yes.
Okay, let me just move on. What about funding for Army Reserves and Army National Guard? Is there special concern and interest regarding them? When I say Army, all of the reserves funding for them. And I need to go quickly because my time is moving.
The answer is yes. I would just say that on the Guard side in particular, it's been a historically busy year last year because of COVID and other issues where the Guard was deployed in record numbers. So that's a unique challenge for the Guard.
And so your funding will focus on the resources that they have lost in all of that effort.
We can't necessarily make up for if someone's civilian employment as a guardsman was impacted by COVID. If like many other Americans, they lost employment income. That's not what our programs are not designed to address that. But we do recognize the historic year the Guard has had, and when we're very focused on making sure that we can take care of our people.
Right. I'm not talking about employment. I'm talking about the overall resources for the Guard. But let me just quickly. There's absolutely no money for the border wall. Is that correct?
In the Department of Defense, that's correct, yes.
And there's no reimbursement money from the Department of Defense for the border wall.
That's correct.
Right. As it relates to Afghanistan and the drawdown, I know that those were increased resources, but are we using adequate resources to ensure, even if military personnel are not there, that we are protecting the civilians during this transition period, and that is the Afghan civilians?
If you're referring to the special immigrant visa population, that is being worked between the Secretary of Defense and the Secretary of State. With respect to the larger population and the impact on Afghanistan, or what the future of civilian safety is between the government of Afghanistan and the Taliban, that's sort of beyond the Defense Department's ability to make an assurance on.
Well, I'd like to get back with you, and I'd rather have that in writing. In addition, I'd like to raise the issue of Ellington, the Ellington base in the Houston area, and would like a writing back on the plans for Ellington Field, which has been a great asset to the community, and I'd like to get some understanding of the vitality of that. I would also like to pursue the issue of the dealing with the sexual assaults and attacks on our young soldiers who really want to be part of the military. As I do that and ask you to give me that answer, I would clearly like to indicate the diversity teaching to our military is not critical race theory. It is relevant. It is America, just like Juneteenth is, and just like reparations HR 40 is. But I'd like you to answer the question on working on these cases that were like Vanessa Guillon. If you could give me that in terms of the strategic plan and funding to do that.
We will.
I'm sorry, I asked you what kind of funding plans you have for Vanessa Guillon. The attack on her and sexual assault training or different pathway for investigations. Do you have funding for that?
I wouldn't say we have funding for a specific case. We have funding for the effort. I thought you were asking, you're expecting a question for the record, or a response for the record on the Secretary's
No,
larger
this one I would
vision.
like it. This one I'd like you just to answer on the whole process of a new approach to those investigations. You would have to have funding for that. Is that being taken into consideration?
Congressman, I would say that as the Secretary's getting just this week more recommendations from his independent review commission, I would expect that some of those will require additional funding we'll have to come back to the Congress for, because they were developed after the budget was submitted.
Gentlewoman's time has
Well, I'd
expired.
encourage you to do that. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back. Thank you.
Thank you. I now recognize the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Donalds, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Admiral, excuse me, and Mr. Undersecretary, thanks so much for being here. Well, let's just get into it. Obviously, the spending proposal from the president on DOD is roughly $753 billion. You talked earlier about comparability issues, comparing our military spending and apparatus to the Chinese military, to the Russian military, excluding personnel costs, healthcare, housing, things that actually deal specifically with the men and women in uniform. How does this budget proposal for DOD compare to the Chinese military and the Russian military?
Ours would still be larger, probably by more of a factor of 2 to 1 if we excluded the 40% of our budget that goes to pay and benefits of our people.
Okay, and following up on that, the rate of growth of our equipment, ships, planes, et cetera, anything associated with that, are we able to keep up with the rate of growth in the Chinese military with the current budget proposal?
I think that over a number of years, in terms of counting numbers of aircraft or assets, China is increasing the size of their force faster than ours. Our quality is higher than theirs. That gap the quality gap is particularly important for us to preserve, given that they may have more numbers than us, or may end up with more numbers than us in certain cases.
Answer me this. I mean, let's talk about the rate of modernization. What is the rate of their modernization of their military assets compared to ours?
We could get you information for the record if you have questions on particular aspects. Do you mean aircraft, ship, or what kind of assets in particular? We will ascertain to get that for you. Of course, these would be intelligence estimates.
Okay, fair enough. Let me ask you a question. Based upon current spending levels outlined by the Biden administration, if we were to play this out over several years, I'm quite sure, Mr. Undersecretary, you have the experience. You've been in the game for some time. About how many years would it take for the Chinese military to catch us?
Well, our goal is for them never to have a capability larger than ours. There's 2 factors here. There's their economic growth, which has been substantial in recent not just years but decades. That gives them a greater capability to draw onto resource. And then there's the specific military technology, some of which has been developed, some of which has been relied on technology stolen from us. So there's the whole cybersecurity aspect as well that we have to take into account. The goal is for the Chinese government never to think that they have an opportunity to overmatch us and therefore have that influence their thinking and have them take risk, thinking that the risks are greater are smaller. I'm sorry than we do.
No, I understand that. And I'm glad that you elaborated. I really wanted to hear from you on that. But I'm going to ask it again. Based upon the spending levels in the president's proposal and the rate of spending, that if we were to control it, essentially, if we were going to take the president's spending levels and maintain that for a decade, let's say, how long will it take for the Chinese military to achieve parity with us? I know the goal is for them never to achieve parity with us, but if this is what the spending levels are going to look like, how long would it take for them to catch parity with us?
Well, I don't think it's purely a function of what we spend, since it depends on their actions as well as ours, but we could try and get you an estimate for the record.
Let me answer this question. Looking at, and I know this is outside your purview, looking at the entire federal proposal from the president, considering that we have inflation issues, considering that we could potentially have an issue where interest on the debt, Medicare, Social Security also crowd out other federal spending. If our military spending capability is constrained by outsized spending in other parts of the federal government, do you think that puts us in a competition issue with the Chinese military sometime over the next decade?
I would agree that we have a fiscal risk, if you want to call it that, of interest on the debt, of inflation increases that could change the fiscal picture. We have enjoyed a period where we've had large increases in the debt since the financial crisis of 2008 that have seen very historically low interest rates that have not really blossomed into interest on the debt, consuming an inordinate part of the federal budget, but that is something that could change, and I believe the Treasury Department and others are looking at that. So
Real quick
yes,
question.
there is a risk
I got
there
10
for
seconds.
sure.
Quick question, not to cut you off. If we don't get our fiscal house in order, does that hurt the military's mission long-term to protect our nation?
It does increase the risk, absolutely.
Thank you. I yield back.
The gentleman's time has expired. Now recognize the gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Grothman, for 5 minutes.
We'll start out with the Vice Admiral. I'm not an expert on military matters at all, was never in the military. Nevertheless, when I read about the Battle of the Midway, there are people who say that the Battle of the Midway, 4 Japanese carriers going down so quickly, kind of showed that aircraft carriers were highly overrated and maybe even obsolete 80 years ago. From what I've read, even though we spend a lot of money on ships protecting the aircraft carriers, modern missiles would provide a big problem for these aircraft carriers. First of all, how many military people on an aircraft carrier? One of the big ones, the Nimitz.
Well, if you think about the carrier itself and the crew and the air wing, it's roughly 5,000-ish.
Okay. So whenever I see us have, what do we have, 14, 15 aircraft carriers out there right now? I wonder, in a real rock'em sock'em big war, how long they'd last. And 2, if other countries would be able to sink them quickly, you'd have such a huge loss of life so quickly. Do you care to comment on the rather large number of, we've got to be number 1 in military in the world. I'll say that no matter what. We've got to be number 1, which is why it kind of bothers me, because think of 15 aircraft carriers like this, and not stupid people will agree that in a real rock'em sock'em war with a really top flight country like China, like Russia, they might not last too long. Do you think we're maybe have too many aircraft carrier, we're too aircraft carrier heavy out there?
Thank you, Congressman. Having been a carrier strike group commander, I had firsthand kind of knowledge of what the capability of the aircraft carrier is. Some of this question will get into the classified realm, and we're happy to come speak to you. But broadly, I can tell you that one of the advantages of the U.S. way of war is the way we fight as a joint all-domain force, an all-domain, of which the aircraft carrier is a critical part of that. One of the things that concerns us, it's not just with the aircraft carrier, but with all capabilities in the specific, is the advent of long-range missiles, systems, the attacking, the space. All those things kind of contribute to a challenge for us in many domains. So to your point, it is on us to figure out how we most effectively fight that force in the future, given the change in threat and what we have to kind of get after that threat. So today's 11 aircraft carriers are part of our plan. How that changes over time is something that we'll continue to evaluate.
And I would just add, Congressman, that an important part of from a Chinese perspective of trying to deter your enemy is to make us believe that our carriers are vulnerable, and therefore make us think that we would not be wise to get our carriers close to where, to the theater there. And so to put in our heads that it won't work, therefore I shouldn't use my carriers. So us countering that is equally important from our perspective.
Okay, my next question for Honorable Michael Mccord is, we've talked a little bit about today about the importance of diversity and the importance of critical race theory. And I've talked to some people in the military who are bothered. As a matter of fact, some people went through our military academies and felt there was a little bit too much of emphasis on this sort of thing. One of the concerns of spending a lot of time talking about this is that perhaps one may promote people or put positions of people in authority based on the boxes they check rather than the best person for the job. Are you confident that none of that is going on in today's military?
I think our military remains one of the most meritocratic institutions in the country. The Secretary's concern is that when you get to the top, although the force is very diverse, the top is still not as diverse as the force that they lead, and I think that's one of his focus areas as he tries to make the force better.
Yeah, I talked to somebody recently, and I don't even want to tell you which academy it was from, but they felt that, I can't remember if it was the top person or the number 2 person there, some guy, was so diversity obsessed that perhaps some decisions were made that shouldn't be made, but you don't think that's happening?
I think that is not true writ large within the military promotion system. No, I think that it's a very much a capability and merit-based system.
You want to comment on that, Mr. Vice Admiral?
I would agree. I mean, our system is designed to be as fair as we can possibly make it, and I think that is exactly what that expectation is put throughout our force in every level. I think we are a meritocracy, and you should rise based on how you have performed, period. And I think that is the overarching desire.
Okay.
But you still have to, I think, address the fact that the statistics aren't great. And so why does that happen? I think we don't know. And so I think it's worthwhile for us to understand it.
Okay, thank you for the 5 minutes.
All right, Chairman's time has expired. Now recognize we're at home stretch, one more Republican witness and our questioner and then me. So now recognize the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Good, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to both of our witnesses for being here today and also for your service that is of such great importance to keeping our nation safe and secure. I'm going to pose a few questions that will build on some of those from earlier today by my friend from Georgia, Mr. Carter. As you both probably know, Admiral Michael Gilday, Chief of Naval Operations, has released a professional reading program list for the military that included Ibram Kendi's book titled How to Be an Anti-Racist. In his book, Mr. Kendi states, quote, "The only remedy to racist discrimination is anti-racist discrimination. The only remedy to past discrimination is present discrimination. The only remedy to present discrimination is future discrimination," end quote. Secretary McCord, do you believe the American taxpayer should be forced to pay for this critical race theory training for our military?
Congressman, I'm not sure that what you're describing involves any taxpayer funds if the CNO recommends that sailors read a book.
So the book would not be provided if selected by the military?
I don't have any information on how the Navy treats that, but we could get that back to you on the record for that.
Okay. Continue to hear anecdotally from members of the military that I know in my district about critical race theory being promoted in the military. How do you think critical race theory training would impact our military's preparedness and ability to face threats such as Communist China?
I'm not aware that it is part of our training program, so that's sort of hypothetical.
Would you believe that critical race training, spending time, efforts, resources on critical race training theory in our military would be beneficial to helping our preparedness?
I think understanding diversity issues in training in that respect is probably useful. I don't think that that's part of our plan, though. What you're describing is not part of the Secretary's initiative.
It's sad to hear about it because I have long believed, and I did not serve as you have, Admiral, but our military for years, decades, have admired being ahead of the curve on integration and merit-based opportunities, and the military has been a model for that for decades in our history, thankfully. The Biden administration, though, has shown, I think, weakness in the face of China, seemingly taking a penitent approach in response to China's criticism back in March when Secretary of State Blinken said, quote, "We're not perfect, we make mistakes, we have reversals, we take steps back, unquote. Earlier this month, President Biden stated that, quote, "According to the intelligence community, terrorism from white supremacy is the most lethal threat to the homeland today, not ISIS, not Al-Qaeda, white supremacists," unquote. Earlier this month, he also said, he told our troops that climate change, when he was overseas in the United Kingdom, climate change was the biggest threat to the country. And so it concerns me that this administration appears to be more focused on climate change and criticizing an undefined extremism in our own military than standing up to entities such as the most pressing threat, Communist China. Admiral Boxall, I won't ask you about the climate change, supposed threat of that being such a great threat, but do you believe that extremism in the military is a more pressing threat than Communist China, for example?
I have stated already that I believe, again, from my view as a military member, the threats from Russia and China remain near the top. We are engaged in a strategy review that will validate, what we believe as a department and what we recommend by the chairman to the secretary as they go through that review. Will be part of that, and I think we'll put those in the right perspectives. So I feel confident that we will have those as they have been. In 2018, we saw a National Defense Strategy Review that, a lot of that will remain valid as we move into the next few years.
That's what I expected your answer to be, and it's reassuring to hear that, and I appreciate that, sir. The Department of Defense recently convened a Countering Extremism Working Group to, quote, "better understand the scope of the problem of extremism in the military." Admiral Boxall, do you know what the definition of the extremism is that this working group plans to study?
I do not, but I can tell you that the chairman, you may have heard him yesterday as he spoke, and I stand behind that 100%. He, like all of us in uniform, wonder, exactly what was driving some of the actions we all saw and were, frankly, very concerned by in January 6th. And we have to look at the facts and the data, and they say that there was a military membership of that, and I think it causes us to force ourselves to look inward and determine, how does that occur, and is there something that we could do to ensure that we make sure that we've done everything we can to eliminate those things which are prejudicial to good order and discipline in our service.
Thank you. I want to just express my views, and I believe the views of most Americans. We're in great debt and gratitude to our military. Thank you every day for what you do to keep us safe, and very concerned and disappointed with how the military has been disparaged by some in this administration in this past 6 months. So thank you very much for being with us today.
Gentleman's time has expired, and apparently I lied. Mr. Moulton from Massachusetts is entitled to his 5 minutes, so I yield those to him now.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Can you hear me okay?
We hear you.
Unlike my colleague who just spoke, I am a veteran, and I am very proud of my service in the United States Marine Corps. I'm very proud of all the troops who are out there serving today, and I'm very proud of the Marine Corps in general. But I can tell you for certain that there is racism in our military today. It hurts our operational effectiveness. It makes us a less capable force. And I admire the leadership of our Department of Defense, as articulated so brilliantly by the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Milley, yesterday in the hearing before our House Armed Services Committee, that attacking this problem is time well spent. But I think what's most shocking about this moment in American history is I cannot think of a better example of cancel culture than Republicans in Congress trying to tell our military academies what books you should read and what books you should not. There is nothing that sets us apart more from Communist China. No greater advantage that we have as Americans, as the United States military, than our ability to think critically. I thought we got past McCarthyism in the 1950s. This is the kind of discussion that you expect to have in Communist China, where they do censor what their citizens read. They dictate how educational institutions are to be run and what is to be taught. It is unbelievably un-American and unpatriotic to be doing that here. A budget, of course, is a statement of your values. And if you look at how this administration is spending its budget, I have some critical questions. But clearly, they are prioritizing the fight against China. Clearly, they are prioritizing the threat of Russia. And they are trying to balance that with the other threats throughout the globe. Let's not forget that our previous president, Mr. Trump, disparaged the military almost every day. He called our troops suckers for volunteering. He called our killed in action losers for having died on the battlefield. So I'm pretty shocked that my colleague on this committee would talk about the Biden administration disparaging our troops. Where's the evidence for that? Yet we saw it every single day from the Trump administration. I'd also like to point out to Ranking Member Smith and other Republican members harping on the top line that President Biden increased the DoD budget this year by $11 billion, a $715 billion top line up from $704 billion the year before. Do you remember what President Trump did to the budget in FY21? He decreased it by $1 billion. Started with $705 billion in FY20. He cut it down to $704 billion in FY21. So I think the ranking member might want to be careful about who's hogwashing whom here when attacking an administration for its budget plan. Vice Admiral Boxall, earlier this year, China's premier announced that central government expenditures on basic research will increase by 10.6%. That's just basic research, the increase for total R&D. The Bipartisan Future Defense Task Force has emphasized that we need to invest more in basic research to get a competitive edge in the future. But I am concerned about a detail of your budget, which is where you're cutting basic research. It's right now, it says you've got 6.1 billion. It comes down from 6.4 to 6.7. Talk to me about that. Obviously, later stage R&D is important, and you've increased funding for that. But one of the clear conclusions of our report is that we need funding for research to increase across the board if we're going to meet the technological threat of our adversaries.
Thank you, sir. I would say that this does have, as you already state, a much more focused effort in the later parts of the RDT&E network. The S&T part of it probably didn't get the same share. However, as you look towards having to get to field capability more quickly and how you want to get after it, you kind of move from that general, the research in the S&T, basic research, and push it into the more further right in the chain to into prototyping and testing and development of capabilities that will actually field more quickly. So it's I think a fair criticism for us to look and make sure that we're properly balanced between S&T and RDT&E. But again, I think for what I've seen this year, given that this is the largest budget increase ever in history in RDT&E writ large, that I feel good about that from a military perspective.
Thank you, Admiral, and thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Great. Gentlemen's time has expired, and now you have myself 10 minutes, which I will not use because you all have been patient enough and long enough. Mr. Moulton began a part of a response that I was going to give, and I'm working from a little bit different set of numbers than he is. He was dealing with discretionary budget authority, but in terms of the function 050, National Defense Budget, are you familiar with that, Mr. Mccord?
Yes.
In the president's President Trump's fiscal 21 budget request, is it accurate to say that his request was for a 0.3% increase?
I don't have the percentage at my fingertips, Chairman, but I believe the percentage increase, the change was very small from 20 to 21, yes.
Exactly, far below 1.6%. And do you know whether in any of the 10-year budgets, 10 fiscal years that were projected in his budget, he got anywhere near a 3 to 5% increase in the defense budget?
There were in the FY 18-19 timeframe a large increase, but not so in the future projections. One did occur a few years ago.
And are you familiar with the fact that in for fiscal year 26, 27, 28, 29, and 30, that the President Trump's budget request projected no increase?
In real terms, yes,
Yep,
that's correct.
Exactly. And isn't it more accurate to say that the 1.6% increase is really, if you take out the expenses, the costs related to Afghanistan, and then applied the budget request to all of the other activities of the department, minus that the percentage increase would be significantly larger than 1.6% in terms of the funding for the remaining activities?
I would agree that the decrease in Afghanistan is probably the biggest single year-to-year change that we see.
Right. The number we had is that it's actually, if you took out the Afghanistan funding, you reallocate that to the rest of the activities, and it would actually mean a 3.6% increase in the total budget request or for the remaining activities.
I don't believe the department thought about it that way, but I don't dispute your characterization.
Okay, thank you. You know, a number of my Republican colleagues have, I wouldn't say ridiculed, but close to it, the allocation of $617 million to climate-related activities. What percentage, approximately, of the total Defense Department budget would that represent?
That would be approximately 1%.
Would it be 1% or 0.1%?
0.1%, I'm sorry.
0.1%. Would you say that the threat posed by climate change represents more than 0.1% of all the threats that we face?
I would, especially if you think about society writ large, the impacts on agriculture and disruption, all those things, yes.
And I do want to clarify one thing. Mr. Smucker referred to my opening statement and questioned you as to whether you thought the threat of two-thirds of our installations was accurate. And you said depends on what kind of installations we're talking about. And what I referenced was the 79 mission assurance priority installations. Would you say that statement about two-thirds of those 79 priority installations was accurate, being threatened by climate?
Yes, if you're looking at those larger installations, which tend to fall much closer to the coast.
Right, thank you. And finally, I told you before I wasn't going to ask about critical race theory, and I'm not going to ask about it, but I do have to push back, as Mr. Moulton did, on a couple of things that were said, and primarily what we heard from Mr. Carter. When he posed the question, do you really think that the troops would feel it was worth fighting for a country that studied critical race theory? And I had to think, you know, is it worth fighting for a country that keeps its citizens ignorant? Or would it be more worth it to fight for a country that keeps its citizens informed, that wants its citizens to know its history, and wants its citizens to understand when there are flaws in that country? And it seems to me that we fought a country in World War II that made all sorts of efforts, basically their raison d'etre, to keep their country, their citizens ignorant of the truth of the way their country acted. And finally, it seems to me that Mr. Carter basically insulted the troops, our troops, because it implies that our troops couldn't handle that information. And our troops aren't smart enough to understand our history and think critically about it.
Mr. Chairman, I object to that statement because that's...
You had your time. You had your time.
It's a violation of House rules. Motives of members.
I was not at all impugning his motives. I just said it seems to me that he's implying that our troops can't handle it. And I think that is...
That he was insulting troops.
That's not motivation. I'm not going to respond. Anyway, again, it seems to me that even though we're not, apparently, teaching critical race theory, and I don't know of one school, one K through 12 school in the country that is teaching critical race theory, although legislatures all over the country now are passing legislation to prevent it. This is kind of like passing legislation to prevent non-existent election fraud. But this is something that is very disturbing because it's, once again, it's a group of citizens stoked by forces in the country that only want to divide the country and find reasons for citizens to be afraid of non-existent threats, and that this movement, the anti-CRT movement, is almost something that I think actually supports the premise of CRT, that there is institutional racism in the country, and we ought to understand its sources and what we can do to combat it. So with that, I will say thank you again for your testimony. Thanks for being so patient. I apologize for all the technical glitches. And I thank you for your responsiveness and your service. And if there's no further business, this meeting is adjourned.